Nero Wolfe and the Coroner's Dilemma. It was a Wednesday in March, when death certificates became interesting, which tells you something about the kind of week I was having. The temperature outside hovered somewhere between winter's last insult and spring's broken promise, and inside the brownstone at 918 West 35th Street, Nero Wolfe was reading a book about Byzantine taxation policy. I know because he told me about it at lunch, in detail, while Fritz served us duckling with cherry sauce that made the whole lecture almost worthwhile. By 3 o'clock I'd balanced the checkbook, typed up correspondence for 2 separate clients who thought Wolfe cared about their thank you notes, and was considering whether to take a walk or find some other way to avoid falling asleep at my desk. That's when the doorbell rang. Fritz appeared from the kitchen, wiping his hands on his apron, through the bulletproof glass panel beside the front door, installed 2 years back after a gentleman with poor impulse control and a .38 decided to express his dissatisfaction with Wolfe's findings. I could see a woman on the stoop, mid-30s, dark hair under a navy blue hat, good coat but not new, and the kind of posture that said she'd been holding herself together through sheer will for about 48 hours too long. Caesar, our largest Doberman, rose from his position near the hall radiator and moved to Fritz's side. The other 4 Dobermans, Mars, Apollo, Minerva and Diana, lifted their heads in unison from various positions around the ground floor. Loyal, the brick-red pit bull who'd walked 200 miles to reach our door 2 years ago, carrying a murdered man's last message, padded over from where he'd been dozing near my desk and sat at attention, his notched ear cocked forward. Fritz glanced at me. I nodded. He opened the door to the length of the chain. "Yes, madam? I need to see Nero Wolfe." Her voice had the cultivated steadiness of someone who'd practiced the sentence. "My name is Helen Garrison. It's about my husband's death. Mr. Wolfe sees visitors only by appointment, madam. If you would care to—" "He was murdered." She said it flatly, without drama, which made it worse somehow. "The coroner says he died of a heart attack. The coroner is lying." Fritz looked at me again. I stood up and came around my desk. Caesar remained at the door, his dark eyes fixed on the woman, evaluating. After a moment his tail moved once, not quite a wag, more of an acknowledgement that she wasn't holding a weapon or radiating the kind of crazy that sets off alarm bells in a dog bred to read human intention like a weather report. "Let her in, Fritz." He unhooked the chain. She stepped into the hall, and I got a better look at her. Brown eyes, tired but sharp, expensive shoes, probably 2 seasons old, wedding ring, no other jewelry. The Dobermans formed a loose semicircle, not threatening, but definitely interested. Loyal moved close enough to her to catch her scent, then retreated to my side, which I'd learned meant nervous but truthful. "I'm Archie Goodwin," I said. "Mr. Wolfe is engaged at the moment. If you'd like to tell me about it, I can decide whether to interrupt him. Will he see me? That depends on what you tell me, and whether I can make it sound interesting enough to pull him away from Byzantine tax policy." She blinked. "I'm sorry? Never mind. Come into the office." I led her down the hall to the office, the dogs trailing along with professional curiosity. She took the red leather chair. I resumed my position at my desk, and Caesar settled near the door while the others distributed themselves strategically. Mars by the window, Apollo near the hall entrance, Minerva and Diana flanking the liquor cabinet. Loyal sat beside my desk chair, his attention fixed on Mrs. Garrison's face. "Your husband died recently?" 3 weeks ago, March 2nd, a Friday evening." She opened her handbag, withdrew a folded document, and handed it across. "This is the death certificate, signed by Dr. Raymond Fletcher, Deputy Medical Examiner for Manhattan. Cause of death, acute myocardial infarction. Natural causes." I unfolded it and scanned the typewritten details. Thomas Garrison, age 41, address on East 68th Street, died at Mount Sinai Hospital at 8:47 p.m. The certificate was properly executed, properly signed, nothing obviously wrong with it, except for the part where the widow sitting in front of me was convinced it was a lie. "What makes you think it wasn't a heart attack?" "Because my husband didn't have a heart condition. He'd had a complete physical examination 2 months earlier, insurance requirement for a policy he was purchasing. Perfect health, strong heart, low blood pressure, no family history of cardiac disease, and because," she stopped, pressed her lips together, "because I was there when he died. I watched him die. It wasn't a heart attack." "What was it?" "I don't know. But it wasn't that." I leaned back in my chair. "Mrs. Garrison, I'm not trying to be difficult, But doctors do know more about heart attacks than the rest of us. People drop dead from heart conditions nobody knew they had. It happens. Not like that, it doesn't. Her voice went tight. He came home from work at 6:30. We had dinner. He seemed fine. Tired maybe, but fine. Around 8 o'clock he complained of feeling dizzy. Then he started sweating badly, and his skin went grey. I called an ambulance. By the time we reached the hospital, he was barely conscious. He died 40 minutes later. The doctors said it was a massive heart attack. But Mr. Goodwin, his pupils were dilated. His hands were trembling. He was confused, disoriented. That's not what a heart attack looks like. How do you know what a heart attack looks like? I was a nurse. Before I married Thomas, I worked at Bellevue for 6 years. I've seen heart attacks. I've seen dozens of them. She met my eyes. What I saw that night looked like poisoning. That got my attention. Loyal's ears pricked forward, and I realized I'd shifted position in my chair. You told the doctors this? Of course I told them. They said I was in shock, that I was imagining things. The attending physician was very kind and very patronizing. He explained that grief can distort our perceptions. Her mouth twisted. I'm a trained nurse. I know the difference between grief and clinical observation. And the coroner, Dr. Fletcher? I tried to speak with him. He refused to see me. His office sent me a letter saying the cause of death had been definitively established and the case was closed. When I persisted, they threatened to have me removed from the building by security. Why would they do that? That's what I'd like to know. I studied her. The story had possibilities. I'd give it that much. Did your husband have enemies? No. He was an accountant. He worked for Hartley and Ross, a private firm on Madison Avenue. Corporate clients, tax preparation, auditing. Nothing controversial. Money problems? None. We weren't wealthy, but we were comfortable. The mortgage was paid. We had savings. Other women? She didn't flinch. No. You're sure? I'm sure. Thomas wasn't that kind of man. And even if he were, you don't murder someone with poison and then somehow convince the coroner to falsify a death certificate. That requires planning, resources, influence. She leaned forward. Mr. Goodwin, someone killed my husband and made it look like natural causes. Someone with enough power to make a deputy medical examiner lie on an official document. I need to know who and why. Can Mr. Wolfe help me? Before I could answer, the sound of the elevator came from the hall, the slow hydraulic groan of Wolfe descending from his afternoon session with the orchids. 4 o'clock on the dot, as reliable as sunrise. The dog's attention shifted collectively toward the hall. Caesar rose to his feet. That's him now, I said. Let me do the talking. The elevator arrived at the ground floor with a thump. Wolfe emerged into the hall and headed for the office with his usual ponderous dignity, all his seventh of a ton moving with surprising grace. He wore a yellow shirt that Fritz had somehow managed to iron without causing it to surrender, and his hair was freshly combed. Theodore must have been talking about the Cattleya hybrids again, because Wolfe had the satisfied expression he gets when someone competent discusses something he cares about. He reached the office doorway, saw Mrs. Garrison in the red leather chair, and stopped. His eyes, which miss approximately nothing, traveled from her face to the death certificate on my desk, to the dog's alert postures, to my expression. The calculation took about 2 seconds. Archie, we have a visitor. Yes, sir. Mrs. Helen Garrison. Her husband died 3 weeks ago of what the coroner says was a heart attack. Mrs. Garrison, who used to be a nurse, thinks it was poison. The deputy medical examiner who signed the death certificate won't talk to her, and his office threatened to have her thrown out when she insisted on answers. She'd like you to find out what happened. Wolfe crossed to his desk, settled into his custom-made chair, and regarded Mrs. Garrison with the expression of a man who'd been hoping to spend the rest of the afternoon reading about Byzantine tax policy and now found himself facing the prospect of actual work. No. She blinked. I beg your pardon? No. I am not interested in your problem, Mrs. Garrison. Medical examinations, coroners, hospitals, these are not matters I concern myself with. I suggest you retain an attorney and pursue the matter through legal channels. He looked at me. Archie, show Mrs. Garrison out. I didn't move. I'd seen Wolfe refuse cases before, it was practically his hobby, but something about this one bothered me. Maybe it was the look in Mrs. Garrison's eyes. Maybe it was the fact that she'd been a nurse and knew what she was talking about. Or maybe it was just the principle of the thing. If a coroner was signing false death certificates, That was a problem that went beyond one widow's grief. "Mrs. Garrison," I said, "would you mind waiting in the front room for a few minutes? Fritz will bring you coffee." She stood slowly, understanding the dismissal, but not liking it. "Mr. Wolfe, I can pay your fee. Whatever it is. I have the insurance money. $20,000. Thomas made sure we'd be taken care of." Wolfe's expression didn't change. "Money is not the issue. The nature of the investigation is unsuitable. Good day, madam." Fritz appeared in the doorway. He has a sixth sense for these things, and escorted Mrs. Garrison out. The dogs watched her go, then settled back into their positions. Loyal remained at my side, looking up at me with an expression that I swear contained reproach. When the front room door closed, I said, "That was fast, even for you." Wolfe picked up the book he'd left on his desk that morning. "I have no interest in medical matters. They are tedious, imprecise, and involve too much contact with institutions I find objectionable. She thinks her husband was poisoned. She thinks many things. She is grief-stricken and looking for patterns in chaos. It is natural but not productive. She was a nurse. She worked at Bellevue for 6 years. She knows what a heart attack looks like. And yet the medical examiner, who presumably has greater expertise, concluded otherwise." He opened his book. "The matter is closed." I stayed where I was. "You don't think it's weird that the coroner won't talk to her? That his office threatened to have her removed? Bureaucratic high-handedness is not weird, Archie. It is standard operating procedure for any government office confronted with persistent civilians." He turned a page. "Now if you'll excuse me, $20,000. Eye material, a trained nurse who says the symptoms don't match the diagnosis. Irrelevant. A deputy medical examiner who won't answer questions about a case he closed. Uninteresting. I gave it one more shot. Someone with enough power to make a city official falsify a death certificate. That got a flicker. Not much, but enough." Wolfe's eyes lifted from his book and fixed on me with the calculating coldness of a man deciding whether to pursue something or swat it away. "You are speculating. So are you. You're speculating that she's wrong, that the coroner is right, and that there's nothing unusual about an accountant dropping dead at 41 from a heart condition nobody knew he had. You're speculating that it's easier to send her away than to spend 10 minutes thinking about whether she might be telling the truth. I am observing," Wolfe said, "that medical investigations are complex, time-consuming, and ultimately dependent on the cooperation of professionals who have no incentive to cooperate with me. Even if Mrs. Garrison's suspicions have merit, which I doubt, pursuing them would require extensive legwork, confrontation with city officials, and probable involvement with the police, all of which I find distasteful. So you'd rather let somebody get away with murder because it's inconvenient?" His eyes narrowed. "You are baiting me. Is it working?" For a moment I thought he'd pick up the book again and ignore me. Then he sighed, the deep put-upon sigh of a man whose assistant refuses to let him enjoy his afternoon, and set the book down. "Bring her back." I grinned. "Yes, sir." I went to the front room where Mrs. Garrison was sitting on the couch with a cup of Fritz's coffee and the kind of rigid posture that said she was preparing herself for another rejection. When she saw my face, some of the tension left her shoulders. "He'll see you? He'll listen. Whether he'll take the case is another question, but at least you'll get a fair hearing." I held the door. "Let's go find out." We returned to the office. She took the red leather chair again, and I resumed my position at my desk. Wolfe regarded her with the expression of a man who'd been talked into something against his better judgment, and was already regretting it. "Mrs. Garrison, you believe your husband was murdered. On what evidence, specifically, do you base this belief?" She didn't hesitate. His symptoms were inconsistent with cardiac arrest. Excessive sweating, dilated pupils, tremors, disorientation, and a rapid progression from apparent health to collapse within 2 hours. That presentation is more consistent with acute poisoning. What sort of poison? I don't know, but there are several substances that could produce those effects. Arsenic, strychnine, certain alkaloids. A competent toxicology examination would have detected them. You assume a toxicology examination was performed. She stopped. It's standard procedure in cases of sudden death. In cases where poisoning is suspected, yes. In cases where the cause of death appears obvious to the examining physician, perhaps not. Wolfe leaned back in his chair. You worked at Bellevue. You understand how overwhelmed city morgues are. Autopsies are cursory at best. If the attending physician at the hospital stated the cause of death was cardiac arrest, and if the body showed no obvious signs of trauma, the medical examiner would have little incentive to pursue further investigation. Then the examination was inadequate. Almost certainly. That does not mean your husband was murdered. It means the system is lazy, not corrupt. The coroner refused to see me. His office threatened me. That's not laziness. That's cover-up. Wolfe picked up a pencil and examined it, as though it contained secrets. Or it is exhaustion, or annoyance at being questioned by a grieving widow who refuses to accept an official finding. Government employees protect themselves with hostility when they feel attacked. It is their nature. You don't believe me. I believe you are sincere. I believe your observations have merit. I do not yet believe your husband was murdered. He set the pencil down. However, I am willing to investigate the question. My fee is substantial. Before we discuss it, I need to know more about your husband's life and work. Tell me about his employment. Mrs. Garrison straightened. Thomas worked for Hartley and Ross for 8 years. He was a senior accountant specializing in corporate tax returns and audits. His clients were primarily mid-sized manufacturing companies and real estate firms. He was diligent, careful, and honest. Was he working on anything unusual before his death? Not that he mentioned. He didn't discuss client details at home. Professional discretion. Did he seem worried or preoccupied in the weeks before he died? She hesitated. He was tired. He'd been working long hours on a project he said was complicated, but he didn't seem frightened or upset, just busy. Did he receive unusual phone calls? Unexpected visitors? No. Changes in routine? Unusual behavior? No. Wolfe frowned. Mrs. Garrison, you are asking me to investigate a murder that may not have occurred, committed by a person unknown, for a motive unestablished. You have given me symptoms but no evidence, suspicions but no proof. This is not a promising beginning. Then get the proof. Demand an autopsy. Force the coroner's office to perform a proper toxicology examination. You're Nero Wolfe. Everyone says you can do anything. Everyone is mistaken, Wolfe said dryly. But I can try. My fee is $20,000. Half in advance, half upon resolution. She went pale. That's everything Thomas left me. Then perhaps you should reconsider whether you truly want to pursue this. For a moment I thought she'd get up and walk out. Then her jaw set. No. If Thomas was murdered, I need to know. I'll pay your fee. Wolfe glanced at me. Archie, prepare a memorandum of agreement. Mrs. Garrison, I will need access to your husband's effects, his papers, correspondence, anything related to his work. I will also need the name of the attending physician at Mount Sinai and written authorization to discuss the case with him. I'll bring everything tomorrow. Satisfactory. One more question. Did your husband have life insurance beyond the $20,000 policy you mentioned? No, just that one. When did he purchase it? 2 months ago. January. Why? We were planning to buy a house. He wanted to make sure I'd be protected if anything happened to him. Wolfe's eyes narrowed fractionally. How prescient. Mrs. Garrison's face went tight. Are you suggesting? I am suggesting nothing. I am observing that a man in perfect health who purchases a large life insurance policy and dies 2 months later is an interesting coincidence. He waved a hand. Bring the documents tomorrow. Archie will see you out. I walked her to the front door. Caesar accompanied us, and Loyal trotted along behind. When Fritz opened the door and she stepped onto the stoop, she turned back to me. Mr. Goodwin, does he really think Thomas bought that insurance because he knew he was going to be killed? I think he doesn't know what to think yet, I said, but he'll figure it out. He always does. She nodded and walked down the steps. I watched her reach the sidewalk and turn west toward 9th Avenue before closing the door. When I returned to the office, Wolfe was scowling at his book like it had personally offended him. Well, I said, what do you really think? I think, Wolfe said slowly, that if her husband was murdered, the killer is intelligent, resourceful, and has considerable influence with the city medical examiner's office. I think the method was sophisticated enough to be mistaken for natural causes by hospital physicians, and I think Mrs. Garrison is correct about one thing. That level of planning suggests motive beyond simple malice. So we're taking the case. We are investigating the possibility of a case. There is a difference. He closed his book with a snap. Tomorrow you will visit Hartley and Ross and inquire about Thomas Garrison's employment. You will also visit Mount Sinai Hospital and speak with the attending physician, and you will visit the medical examiner's office and attempt with appropriate discretion to determine why Dr. Raymond Fletcher refuses to discuss the matter. That's a lot of visiting. You enjoy legwork. Consider it recreation. What will you be doing? Thinking. Someone needs to. He stood up. Dinner at 7. Fritz is preparing lamb chops with rosemary. Do try not to be late. He headed for the elevator, leaving me alone with the dogs and the growing suspicion that this case was going to be more complicated than either of us wanted it to be. Caesar returned to his position near the hall radiator. Loyal sat beside my desk, looking up at me with what I chose to interpret as encouragement. You think she's telling the truth? I asked him. His tail thumped once against the floor. Yeah, I said. Me too. I returned to my desk and started typing up the memorandum of agreement. Outside, the March afternoon faded into evening, and somewhere in the city, a dead man's secrets waited to be found. If Helen Garrison was right, someone had committed the perfect murder and gotten away with it. Wolfe's job and mine was to make sure it stayed imperfect just long enough for justice to catch up. Thursday morning arrived cold and grey, with the kind of wet wind that makes you regret living in a city built on the edge of a river. I had breakfast with Wolfe at 8:30, Fritz's sourdough toast, perfectly scrambled eggs, and bacon that probably had a better life than most people, and by 9:15 I was standing on the sidewalk in front of 520 First Avenue, looking up at the office of the chief medical examiner, like a man preparing to storm a bureaucratic fortress. The building was an unremarkable brick affair that radiated all the charm of a filing cabinet. I went through the main entrance and found myself in a lobby that smelled of disinfectant and despair. A uniformed guard sat behind a desk reading the daily news. He looked up when I approached, and his expression suggested he'd already decided I was going to be a problem. Help you? I'd like to speak with Dr. Raymond Fletcher. You got an appointment? No, but I've got a legitimate question about a death certificate he signed. The guard reached for a clipboard. Name? Archie Goodwin. Nature of your business? Private inquiry on behalf of a client. That got me a long look. You a lawyer? Private investigator. Uh-huh. He picked up a phone, dialed 3 digits, and waited. Yeah, Jerry. I got a PI down here. Wants to see Dr. Fletcher. No appointment. Says it's about a death certificate. He listened for a moment, then hung up. Dr. Fletcher don't see nobody without an appointment. You want to leave your name and number. Somebody might call you back. When? Couldn't say. I gave him my most charming smile, which on a Thursday morning in March isn't saying much. Look, I'm not trying to make trouble. I just need 5 minutes to ask a couple questions about a case. Thomas Garrison, died March 2nd. Dr. Fletcher signed the death certificate. The widow has some concerns about you, the second person asking about that case. The second? The widow was here Tuesday, made a scene in the waiting room upstairs, had to have security escort her out. What kind of scene? The guard shrugged, yelling, crying, saying we were covering something up. Dr. Fletcher's secretary told her the case was closed and she needed to leave. She wouldn't, so we removed her. He gave me a flat stare. You planning to make a scene too? I'm planning to be polite and reasonable until somebody gives me a reason not to be. Then I'm gonna save us both some trouble and tell you right now, Dr. Fletcher ain't seeing you. His office sent out a memo Wednesday morning saying anybody asking about the Garrison case should be referred to the city attorney's office. So unless you got legal standing, you're wasting your time. Why would they refer it to the city attorney? I just work the desk, pal. I don't ask questions. I considered my options. Pushing harder would get me thrown out. Same as Helen Garrison. Coming back with a lawyer would take time and probably wouldn't accomplish anything. What I needed was leverage, and I wasn't going to find it in the lobby. All right, I said. Thanks for your help. Yeah, sure. I left the building and walked 2 blocks to a coffee shop on 28th Street, where I sat at the counter and thought about bureaucrats who refer routine inquiries to city attorneys. It was the kind of defensive maneuver you make when you're worried about liability, which suggested Helen Garrison's persistence had rattled somebody. The question was whether they were rattled because they'd done something wrong, or just because they were tired of dealing with a grieving widow who wouldn't take no for an answer. I finished my coffee and took a taxi up to Mount Sinai Hospital on 5th Avenue and 100th Street. The place was huge, efficient, and overwhelmingly white. Walls, floors, uniforms, everything. I asked directions at the main desk and was directed to the administrative offices on the 3rd floor, where a middle-aged woman with steel grey hair and the expression of someone who'd heard every excuse in the book, asked how she could help me. "I'd like to speak with the physician who attended Thomas Garrison when he was brought in 3 weeks ago. Friday, March 2nd, around 8:30 in the evening. Are you family? I'm representing Mrs. Garrison. She's asked me to follow up on her husband's treatment." The woman frowned. "I'll need to see written authorization." I pulled out the letter Helen Garrison had given me and handed it over. She read it carefully, then picked up a phone. "Dr. Brennan's office, please." A pause. "Yes, this is Judith in admin. I have someone here asking about a patient Dr. Brennan attended. Thomas Garrison. Admitted March 2nd. Yes, I'll hold." She put her hand over the mouthpiece. Dr. Brennan was the attending physician. His office will tell us if he's available. 2 minutes later, I was being escorted down a corridor to a small office where a man in his early 50s sat behind a desk, covered with patient files and medical journals. He looked up when I came in, and I saw the weariness that comes from working too many consecutive shifts with too little sleep. "You're here about Thomas Garrison." "That's right, Archie Goodwin. I'm working for Mrs. Garrison. Have a seat." He gestured to a chair. "What does she want to know?" "She wants to know why her husband died. Heart attack. Massive myocardial infarction. It's all in the hospital records. She was a nurse. She says the symptoms didn't look like a heart attack." Dr. Brennan sighed. "Mr. Goodwin, Mrs. Garrison was in shock. She'd just watched her husband die. Her observations were compromised by trauma and grief. I understand she's looking for answers, but sometimes there aren't any. A healthy man in his 40s can have an undiagnosed cardiac condition that kills him without warning. It's tragic, but it happens." "Did you order a toxicology screen?" "No." "Why not?" "Because there was no indication of poisoning. The patient presented with classic symptoms of acute cardiac arrest, chest pain, diaphoresis, shortness of breath, loss of consciousness. The EKG confirmed massive myocardial damage. There was no reason to suspect poisoning. Mrs. Garrison says his pupils were dilated and he was disoriented, consistent with shock and oxygen deprivation during cardiac arrest. She also says he was sweating excessively. Diaphoresis is a cardinal symptom of heart attack." I leaned back in my chair. "Doctor, I'm not trying to tell you how to do your job, but Mrs. Garrison is convinced something else killed her husband, and she's not the type to imagine things. She worked at Bellevue for 6 years. She knows what she saw." Dr. Brennan's expression hardened. "Are you suggesting I misdiagnosed the cause of death?" "I'm suggesting that maybe it's worth a second look. The medical examiner performed an autopsy. He concurred with my diagnosis. The case is closed. Was a toxicology screen performed during the autopsy? You'd have to ask the medical examiner's office." "I tried. They won't talk to me. Then I suggest you retain an attorney and pursue the matter through legal channels." He stood up. "I have patients to see. If Mrs. Garrison has further questions, she can contact the hospital's patient advocate office." I stood too. "One more thing. In your professional opinion, was there anything unusual about Thomas Garrison's death? Anything that struck you as inconsistent or unexpected?" He hesitated. It was only a fraction of a second, but it was there, a flicker of something that might have been doubt or memory, or just exhaustion. Then his professional mask slid back into place. "No, nothing unusual. Good day, Mr. Goodwin. I left the hospital with the distinct impression that Dr. Brennan had told me the truth but not the whole truth, which is the kind of distinction that keeps private investigators employed. He diagnosed a heart attack because that's what the symptoms looked like, and the medical examiner had confirmed it because that's what the body looked like, and neither of them had any reason to look deeper because dead men in their 40s are sad but not suspicious, unless someone decided they should be." By the time I got back to the brownstone, it was 12:30. Fritz was in the kitchen preparing lunch, and the smell of chicken soup filled the hall. The dogs greeted me at the door: Caesar's inspection, Mars's posture, Apollo's alert attention, Minerva's careful assessment, Diana's quick circuit around me, and Loyal's particular focus on my expression. I gave Caesar a scratch behind the ears and headed for the office. Wolfe was at his desk, reading seed catalogues with the concentration most people reserve for religious texts. He looked up when I entered. "Well," I dropped into my chair. The medical examiner's office referred all questions about Thomas Garrison to the city attorney's office, which means somebody's worried about liability. The attending physician at Mount Sinai diagnosed heart attack based on classic symptoms and saw no reason to suspect poisoning. No toxicology screen was ordered at the hospital, and the autopsy apparently confirmed the diagnosis, but I can't verify whether a tox screen was performed during the autopsy, because nobody at the ME's office will talk to me. Did Dr. Brennan seem certain of his diagnosis? He seemed defensive, which isn't the same thing. When I asked if there was anything unusual about the death, he hesitated before saying no. Interesting, maybe, or maybe he was just annoyed at being questioned by a civilian. Wolfe set down his catalogue. The city attorney's involvement is significant. If the medical examiner's office believed the case was routine, they would have simply refused to discuss it. Referring inquiries to legal counsel suggests they anticipate litigation, or they're trying to shut down Helen Garrison before she becomes a problem. Perhaps. He picked up a slip of paper from his desk. Mrs. Garrison telephoned while you were out. She will arrive at 2:30 with her husband's papers. You will examine them for anything of interest. What are you going to do? I am going to think about coroners who refuse to answer questions and physicians who hesitate before lying. He opened his catalogue again. And then I am going to have lunch. Fritz appeared in the doorway. Lunch is ready, gentlemen. We went to the dining room, where Fritz had laid out his chicken soup, the kind with actual pieces of chicken and vegetables that hadn't been boiled into submission, along with fresh bread and a salad. Wolfe ate with his usual focused attention, saying nothing, which meant he was working on something in that enormous brain of his. I ate and watched Caesar settle near the doorway, while the other dogs distributed themselves around the room with the practiced ease of professionals who knew when to be alert and when to relax. At 2:30 sharp, the doorbell rang. Fritz opened the door to Helen Garrison, who was carrying a large leather satchel and wearing the same determined expression she'd had the day before. Caesar rose to inspect her, received some unspoken signal from the other dogs that she'd been here before and was acceptable, and settled back down. Mrs. Garrison came into the office and set the satchel on the corner of my desk. Everything I could find, she said. His appointment book, correspondence, bank statements, receipts, the insurance policy, and some files he kept at home. I started pulling documents out while Wolfe watched from his desk. The insurance policy was straightforward, $20,000, purchased in January from Metropolitan Life, with Mrs. Garrison as the sole beneficiary. The bank statements showed regular deposits from Hartley and Ross and unremarkable expenses. The correspondence was mostly routine, letters from clients, memos from his firm, nothing that jumped out as suspicious. The appointment book was more interesting. Thomas Garrison had been meticulous about recording his schedule, client meetings, lunch appointments, deadlines. I flipped back through January and February, looking for patterns. Most entries were business-related, but there were a few personal notations: dinner with Helen, a dentist appointment, a reminder to pick up his suits from the cleaner. Then, on February 10th, I found an entry that didn't match the others. Meeting RF 4 p.m. confidential. I held it up. Mrs. Garrison, do you know what this means? She leaned over to look. No, Thomas didn't mention it. Who's RF? I don't know. I showed it to Wolfe. He studied it for a moment, then looked at Mrs. Garrison. Your husband met with someone whose initials are RF 3 weeks before his death. The notation says confidential. That suggests the meeting was not related to his normal business, or it was related to sensitive client business he couldn't discuss at home, I said. Perhaps. Wolfe turned to Mrs. Garrison. Did your husband ever mention meeting with someone named Fletcher? Her face went pale. Raymond Fletcher? The coroner? The deputy medical examiner? Yes. Thomas never mentioned knowing him. Why would he? That, Wolfe said, is an excellent question. He leaned back in his chair. Archie, telephone Hartley and Ross and arrange an appointment with the senior partner. I want to know about Thomas Garrison's clients and his current projects, and I want to know why he was meeting with the deputy medical examiner 3 weeks before he died. I reached for the phone. Yes, sir. The case was starting to get interesting. A dead accountant, a coroner who wouldn't talk, and a mysterious meeting marked confidential in an appointment book. Somewhere in that mix was a motive for murder, assuming there'd been a murder at all. But the more I learned, the more I thought Helen Garrison might be right. Someone had killed Thomas Garrison and made it look like natural causes, and someone with enough influence had made sure the coroner's office wouldn't ask questions. Finding out who and why was going to take more than charm and persistence. It was going to take the kind of methodical, relentless investigation that Nero Wolfe specialized in, the kind that turns over every rock until something ugly crawls out. I got the senior partner secretary on the line and started making arrangements. Behind me, Wolfe sat at his desk with his eyes half closed, thinking. The dogs watched from their positions around the room, silent and attentive. Outside, the March afternoon continued its cold grey march toward evening. And somewhere in the city, a killer was probably feeling very confident that the perfect murder would stay perfect. That confidence, I thought, was about to become a problem. Hartley and Ross occupied 3 floors of a building on Madison Avenue in the low 40s, the kind of address that says established and expensive without being ostentatious about it. I arrived Friday morning at 10 o'clock, was directed to a waiting room with leather furniture and hunting prints, and spent 15 minutes reading a copy of Fortune before a secretary led me down a paneled corridor to an office with a view of the street. The man behind the desk was somewhere north of 60, with silver hair, a 3-piece suit that probably cost more than my monthly salary, and the kind of smooth, professional face you develop after 40 years of telling clients their tax problems aren't as bad as they think, while privately calculating how much you can charge them to fix it. He stood when I entered and offered his hand. "Mr. Goodwin, I'm Lawrence Hartley. Please sit down." I sat in one of the client chairs, expensive leather, comfortable without being soft, and he resumed his position behind his desk. The office was immaculate, law books on the shelves, framed diplomas on the wall, a silver pen set beside a leather blotter. Everything about it said success, discretion, and careful attention to detail. "I understand you're making inquiries about Thomas Garrison," Hartley said. "On behalf of his widow, I believe?" "That's right. Mrs. Garrison has some questions about her husband's death, and she's retained Nero Wolfe to look into it." Hartley's expression became carefully neutral. "I see. I'm not sure what I can tell you, Mr. Goodwin. Thomas was an excellent accountant, a valued member of our firm, and his death was a shock to all of us. But I'm not aware of anything unusual about it. Mrs. Garrison thinks he was poisoned." "Poisoned?" Hartley's eyebrows rose. "That's absurd. Thomas died of a heart attack. The hospital confirmed it. So did the medical examiner. She was a nurse. She says the symptoms didn't match. With all respect to Mrs. Garrison, she's not a physician. Grief can distort one's perceptions." He leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Goodwin, I knew Thomas for 8 years. He was healthy, energetic, dedicated to his work. But he was also under considerable stress. He'd been working long hours on several complex accounts. It's unfortunate, but not unheard of, for someone in his situation to suffer a cardiac event." "What accounts was he working on?" Hartley hesitated. "I'm not at liberty to discuss client business without authorization." I pulled out the authorization letter Helen Garrison had signed and handed it across the desk. "Mrs. Garrison has given me permission to review her husband's work files." He read the letter carefully, then set it aside. "Very well. Thomas had been working on 3 major accounts in the months before his death. Brenner Manufacturing, a mid-sized firm that produces industrial equipment, Kessler Properties, a real estate development company, and Margulis Imports, which handles luxury goods from Europe. All 3 required extensive auditing and tax preparation. Anything unusual about any of them?" "Unusual in what sense?" "In the sense that might give someone a reason to want Thomas Garrison dead." Hartley's face went cold. "Mr. Goodwin, are you suggesting one of our clients murdered Thomas?" "I'm suggesting that if Mrs. Garrison is right about her husband being poisoned, we need to look at who might have had a motive. You just told me he was working on 3 accounts that required extensive auditing. Audits turn up problems. Problems give people reasons to want auditors to go away." "That's preposterous. Our clients are reputable businesses. They're certainly not in the habit of murdering accountants." "Maybe not. But if Thomas found something in one of those audits, something someone wanted to hide, that would be a motive." Hartley stood up. "I think this conversation is over. I've answered your questions out of respect for Helen Garrison, but I won't sit here and listen to you accuse our clients of murder without a shred of evidence." I stayed in my chair. "Mr. Hartley, I'm not accusing anybody of anything. I'm trying to find out whether Mrs. Garrison's suspicions have merit. If they don't, then we'll apologize for wasting everyone's time and go away. But if they do, then someone committed murder and got away with it, and that's something we need to know." He remained standing. "Thomas Garrison died of a heart attack. His death was tragic but natural. I understand Mrs. Garrison needs someone to blame, but manufacturing conspiracy theories about audits and murder isn't going to bring her husband back. Did Thomas mention meeting with Raymond Fletcher?" That stopped him. Who? Raymond Fletcher, Deputy Medical Examiner. Thomas had an appointment with him on February 10th. It was marked confidential in his appointment book. Hartley's face showed nothing. I have no knowledge of any such meeting. You're sure? If Thomas met with the medical examiner, he didn't discuss it with me, and I can't imagine why he would need to. Neither can I, but he did, and 3 weeks later he was dead, and Fletcher signed his death certificate. That's an interesting coincidence, or it's nothing at all. Hartley moved toward the door. I'm afraid I have another appointment, Mr. Goodwin. If you need anything further, you can contact our office and make arrangements. I stood up. One more thing. Was Thomas worried about anything in the weeks before he died? Did he seem frightened or anxious? He seemed tired. But that's hardly unusual for someone working on multiple complex accounts. Hartley opened the door. Good day, Mr. Goodwin. I left the office, took the elevator down to the lobby, and stood on the sidewalk trying to decide whether Lawrence Hartley was hiding something or just being protective of his firm's reputation. The answer was probably both. Nobody wants to admit their clients might be murderers, and nobody wants a private investigator poking around in their business files looking for motive. But something about the conversation bothered me. Hartley had been smooth and professional until I mentioned Raymond Fletcher, and then he'd gone very still for just a moment before denying any knowledge of the meeting. It was the same kind of tell I'd seen in Dr. Brennan's office. The brief hesitation before the denial, the flicker of something that might have been recognition or concern, or just surprise. I found a phone booth on the corner and called the brownstone. Fritz answered, and a moment later Wolfe's voice came on the line. Yes? Hartley says Thomas Garrison was working on 3 accounts: Brenner Manufacturing, Kessler Properties, and Margolis Imports. All 3 required auditing. He claims nothing unusual turned up in any of them, but he wasn't eager to discuss details. When I mentioned the February 10th meeting with Fletcher, he went very careful and denied knowing anything about it. Did you believe him? About the meeting? No. About the accounts? I'm not sure. He could be telling the truth, or he could be covering for a client. Hard to say without seeing the actual files. Mrs. Garrison's authorization letter gives you access to her husband's work files. Hartley wasn't inclined to let me rummage through confidential client documents based on a widow's letter. I'd need something more official, or something less official. Wolfe was quiet for a moment. Return to the brownstone. I want you to visit those 3 companies this afternoon and make discreet inquiries about Thomas Garrison's work. Don't mention murder or poisoning. Simply indicate that you're following up on his auditing work and see what reactions you get. You think one of them killed him? I think someone did, assuming Mrs. Garrison is correct. And I think the February 10th meeting with Raymond Fletcher is connected. An accountant doesn't meet with a deputy medical examiner without a reason. Find the reason. Yes, sir. I hung up and took a taxi back to West 35th Street. When I walked into the brownstone, the dogs performed their usual greeting ritual, Caesar's inspection, the others' assessment, Loyal's particular attention to my mood. I gave them each a scratch and headed for the office, where Wolfe was reading a seed catalogue with the expression of a man planning next year's orchid acquisitions. Hartley stonewalled me, I said, dropping into my chair, which means either he's hiding something or he thinks I'm wasting his time. Could be both. Did you get the addresses of the 3 companies? I pulled out my notebook. Brenner Manufacturing is in Brooklyn. Kessler Properties has an office on Park Avenue. Margolis Imports is down in the Garment District. You want me to hit all 3 this afternoon? If possible, pay particular attention to their reactions when you mention Thomas Garrison's name. Fear is difficult to hide. So is annoyance at being bothered by private investigators. Indeed. Wolfe turned a page in his catalogue. One more thing, Archie. When you visit Margolis Imports, inquire specifically about their European connections. Luxury goods from Europe require customs documentation, import licenses, and considerable financial oversight. If Thomas Garrison was auditing their books, he would have reviewed all of that material. You think they're smuggling something? I think smuggling is an excellent way to generate undocumented income, which is an excellent reason to want your auditor to stop asking questions. He glanced up at me, but I could be wrong. That's why you're going to find out. I spent the next hour making phone calls and setting up appointments, then grabbed a sandwich from the kitchen and headed back out into the March afternoon. Fritz packed me an extra sandwich and an apple, which tells you something about how he views my eating habits when I'm working. The dogs watched me leave with what I chose to interpret as encouragement. First stop was Brenner Manufacturing in Red Hook, Brooklyn. The place was a 3-story brick building surrounded by warehouses and truck depots, the kind of industrial neighborhood where everything smells like diesel fuel and ambition. I gave my name to the receptionist, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and a phone headset, and 5 minutes later, I was sitting across from the plant manager, a man named Kowalski, who had the broad shoulders and calloused hands of someone who'd worked his way up from the factory floor. "You're here about Tom Garrison?" he said, leaning back in his chair. "Hell of a thing, him dying like that. Good man, knew his business." His widow asked me to follow up on some of his work. "I understand he was auditing your books?" "That's right. Annual tax preparation and compliance review. We've used Hartley and Ross for years. Never had a problem." "Did the audit turn up anything unusual?" Kowalski shrugged. "Some depreciation schedules needed adjusting. Couple of expenses that weren't properly categorized. Nothing major. Tom fixed it all before he finished." "Did he seem worried about anything?" "Worried? No. Tired, maybe. He was here 3 days straight in February, going through every ledger and receipt we had. That kind of detail work wears you down." "Did he mention meeting with anyone from the medical examiner's office?" Kowalski blinked. "The medical examiner? Why the hell would he do that?" "That's what I'm trying to find out. Can't help you. Far as I know, Tom never talked about anything except accounting and baseball. Guy was a Yankees fan. Used to give me grief about the Dodgers." He smiled briefly, then sobered. "His wife doing okay?" "She's managing. Tell her we're sorry for her loss. Tom was good people." I left Brenner Manufacturing with the impression that Kowalski was exactly what he appeared to be, a straight shooter running a legitimate business who'd liked Thomas Garrison and had no reason to want him dead. Unless he was a hell of an actor, Brenner Manufacturing was a dead end. Second stop was Kessler Properties on Park Avenue, a sleek office suite with modern furniture and abstract art on the walls. The company developed residential and commercial properties in Manhattan and the outer boroughs, and from the look of the place, business was good. I was shown into a conference room and greeted by Philip Kessler himself, a man in his early 40s with styled hair, an expensive suit, and the smooth confidence of someone who'd never met a deal he couldn't close. "Mr. Goodwin, my secretary said you're following up on Thomas Garrison's work. Terrible what happened to him. Absolutely terrible. His widow has some questions about the circumstances of his death." "Questions?" Kessler's smile didn't waver, but something behind his eyes went very alert. "What kind of questions?" "Medical questions. She's concerned the diagnosis might have been incomplete." "I see. Well, I'm not sure how we can help with that. Thomas did excellent work for us, reviewed our books, prepared our tax returns, made sure we were in compliance with all relevant regulations. But I don't know anything about his health or his death beyond what I read in the obituary." "How long had he been working on your account?" "About 3 months. We engaged Hartley and Ross in December for a comprehensive audit and tax preparation. Thomas was assigned to the project." "Did the audit turn up any problems?" "Problems?" Kessler's tone remained pleasant, but the alertness behind his eyes intensified. "Nothing significant. Some documentation issues, a few receipts that needed better organization. Standard stuff for a company our size. Nothing that would concern the authorities." "Of course not. We run a legitimate business, Mr. Goodwin. Our books are clean." "I'm sure they are. Did Thomas ever mention meeting with anyone from the medical examiner's office?" Kessler went very still. "Why would he do that?" "I was hoping you could tell me. I have no idea what you're talking about." He stood up. "Mr. Goodwin, I've been patient with your questions, but I'm starting to wonder what you're really after. If Mrs. Garrison has concerns about her husband's death, she should take them up with his doctors, not with his clients. We had a professional relationship with Thomas Garrison, nothing more. His work for us was exemplary and completely above board. I'm not suggesting otherwise. Aren't you?" Kessler moved toward the door. "I think we're done here. If you have further questions, direct them to our attorney." I left Kessler Properties with a different impression than I'd gotten from Brenner Manufacturing. Philip Kessler had been too smooth, too careful, and too quick to end the conversation when I mentioned the medical examiner. He was hiding something. I'd bet my month's salary on it. Whether it was connected to Thomas Garrison's death was another question, but at minimum it was worth digging deeper. Third stop was Margolis Imports, located in a 5-story building on 38th Street in the Garment District. The neighborhood was busy with delivery trucks, garment racks being wheeled down the sidewalk, and the general organized chaos of an industry that never slept. I climbed 3 flights of stairs. The elevator had an out-of-order sign that looked permanent, and found the Margolis Imports office at the end of a dim hallway. The reception area was small and cluttered, with boxes stacked along one wall and invoices scattered across the receptionist's desk. A woman in her 30s with dark hair and tired eyes looked up when I entered. "Can I help you? I'm looking for Mr. Margolis. I have some questions about work Thomas Garrison was doing for your company." Her expression changed. "Not much, but enough. Mr. Margolis isn't in. Can I take a message? When will he be back?" "I'm not sure. He's been out of the office all week." "This is important. Mrs. Garrison hired me to follow up on her husband's work." The woman hesitated, then lowered her voice. "Look, I don't know what you're after, but whatever Tom Garrison found in our books got him fired from the account 3 weeks ago." Mr. Margolis was furious, said Tom was making accusations he couldn't prove and causing problems with our suppliers. The whole thing was a mess. Garrison was fired. Hartley and Ross pulled him off the account after Mr. Margolis complained. Tom came by once after that, trying to talk to Mr. Margolis, but he wouldn't see him. That was the last time I saw Tom. She glanced toward the closed office door. A week later I heard he was dead. What kind of accusations was Garrison making? I don't know the details. Something about discrepancies in the import documentation. Tom thought merchandise was being brought in that wasn't showing up in the books. Mr. Margolis said it was a clerical error, that Tom was confused, but he was angry enough to call Hartley and demand a new accountant. Did Garrison mention talking to anyone at the medical examiner's office? She frowned. The medical examiner? No. Why would he? That's what I'm trying to figure out. The office door opened and a man emerged. Mid-50s, stocky, with thinning hair and the harassed expression of someone who'd been dealing with problems he didn't have solutions for. He stopped when he saw me. "Who are you?" "Archie Goodwin. I'm following up on some work Thomas Garrison was doing for your company before he died." Margolis's face darkened. "Get out. I just have a few questions." I said, "Get out." Tom Garrison nearly destroyed my business with his paranoid accusations and incompetent auditing. I don't know what his widow told you, but I'm not answering any questions. Now leave before I call the police. Did you know Garrison met with the deputy medical examiner 3 weeks before he died? Margolis's expression flickered. Surprise, maybe, or recognition. Then it hardened into anger. "Out, now." I left. Sometimes you learn more from what people won't tell you than from what they will, and Margolis's reaction told me plenty. Thomas Garrison had found something in Margolis Imports books, something significant enough to get him fired from the account. And Margolis's reaction to the mention of Raymond Fletcher suggested he knew more about that meeting than he was willing to admit. I found another phone booth and called the brownstone. When Wolfe came on the line, I gave him the summary. "Brenner Manufacturing looks clean. Kessler Properties made me nervous." Kessler went very careful when I mentioned Fletcher and ended the conversation fast. But Margolis Imports is where it gets interesting. Garrison was fired from the account 3 weeks before he died because he found discrepancies in their import documentation. The receptionist said he thought merchandise was being brought in that wasn't showing up in the books. "Smuggling," Wolfe said with satisfaction. "That's what I figured. And when I mentioned Fletcher to Margolis, he nearly threw me down the stairs. Whatever Garrison found, Margolis doesn't want anyone looking at it. Return to the brownstone. We need to discuss this with Mrs. Garrison." "You think Margolis killed him?" "I think Thomas Garrison discovered something that threatened Margolis's business, and I think Raymond Fletcher is somehow involved in covering it up. How and why remains to be determined." Wolfe paused. "Archie, one more thing. When you return, bring Saul Panzer. I want surveillance on Margolis Imports and on Raymond Fletcher. If they're connected, they'll communicate. I want to know how." "Yes, sir." I hung up and took a taxi back to the brownstone, my mind working through the pieces. A smuggling operation, a dead accountant, and a deputy medical examiner who refused to answer questions. The connections were starting to form, but the picture wasn't complete yet. When I walked through the door, Caesar met me with his usual inspection, and the other dogs checked me over with professional interest. Loyal sat beside me as I headed for the office, his attention fixed on my face with that particular intensity he had when he sensed something important was happening. "You're right," I told him. "This is getting interesting." His tail thumped once against the floor. Yeah, interesting was one word for it. Dangerous was another. But that was the job. And if Thomas Garrison had been murdered because he'd stumbled onto something he wasn't supposed to see, then it was our job to finish what he'd started and make sure whoever killed him paid for it. Mrs. Garrison arrived at the brownstone at 5 o'clock, escorted by Fritz from the front door to the office with his usual courtly dignity. The dogs performed their evaluation, Caesar's approval, the other's acceptance, and she took the red leather chair with the careful posture of someone bracing for bad news. Wolfe was behind his desk with a glass of beer, having just come down from the plant rooms, and I was at my desk with my notebook. "You've learned something," she said. "Not a question. We've learned several things," Wolfe replied. "Not all of them pleasant. Before we discuss them, I need you to answer a question. Did your husband ever mention problems with one of his clients? Specifically, did he mention Margolis Imports?" Her brow furrowed. "The import company?" "He mentioned them. Yes. He said the audit was complicated, that there were documentation issues he was trying to sort out. But he didn't say there were problems, exactly. Just that it was taking longer than expected." "When did he mention this?" "Mid-February, I think. Maybe a week before he died." "Did he seem worried?" "No. Frustrated, perhaps, but not worried." Wolfe nodded slowly. "Mrs. Garrison, your husband was fired from the Margolis Imports account 3 weeks before his death. According to the receptionist at Margolis Imports, he'd discovered discrepancies in their import documentation, merchandise being brought into the country that wasn't appearing in their books. When he raised questions about it, the owner complained to Hartley and Ross and had your husband removed from the account." Mrs. Garrison's face went pale. "Thomas never told me he'd been fired. He may not have considered it a firing. More likely Hartley and Ross simply reassigned him to other work and told him to drop the Margolis investigation. But your husband didn't drop it. He tried to contact Margolis after being removed from the account. The receptionist said he came to their office trying to speak with the owner, who refused to see him. Why would Thomas pursue it if he'd been taken off the account? Because, Wolfe said, he'd discovered something that concerned him, something significant enough that he felt obligated to follow up even after being told to stop. And I believe that's why he met with Raymond Fletcher on February 10th. I leaned forward. "You think Garrison went to the medical examiner because of what he found at Margolis Imports?" "I think he went to Fletcher because what he found at Margolis Imports had medical implications. Smuggling operations don't typically interest coroners unless the contraband involves drugs, pharmaceuticals, or other substances that fall under medical jurisdiction." Mrs. Garrison stared at him. "You think Margolis was smuggling drugs, or pharmaceutical supplies, or medical equipment? Something that would require falsified import documentation and something that would concern a deputy medical examiner if brought to his attention." Wolfe drank some beer. "Tell me, Mrs. Garrison, did your husband have any connection to Raymond Fletcher before February 10th? Any professional relationship? Any social acquaintance?" "Not that I know of. I'd never heard the name until you mentioned it." "Then why would your husband choose Fletcher specifically to discuss his suspicions about Margolis Imports?" She shook her head. "I don't know. Neither do I. But I intend to find out." Wolfe looked at me. "Archie, contact Saul Panzer. I want surveillance on both Margolis Imports and on Raymond Fletcher's residence. If they're connected, they'll meet or communicate. When they do, I want to know about it." "Saul's expensive. Mrs. Garrison is paying us $20,000. We can afford Saul." He turned back to Mrs. Garrison. "Madam, I must ask you a difficult question. Is it possible your husband was involved in Margolis's smuggling operation? That he was a participant rather than an investigator?" Her face flushed. "Absolutely not." Thomas was honest. "He would never—" I asked because it would explain why he met with Fletcher. If he was involved and wanted out, or if he was being pressured to cooperate, he might have sought help from someone in law enforcement or a related field. Thomas was not a criminal. Then he was a threat to one. And 3 weeks after meeting with Raymond Fletcher, your husband died of what the same Raymond Fletcher certified as natural causes. Wolfe set down his glass. "Mrs. Garrison, I believe your husband was murdered. I believe he was killed because he discovered Margolis's smuggling operation and threatened to expose it. And I believe Raymond Fletcher is complicit in covering up that murder." The office went very quiet. Mrs. Garrison sat frozen in the red leather chair, her hands gripping the armrests. The dogs sensed the tension. Caesar shifted position near the door. Mars moved closer to Wolfe's desk, and Loyal's attention fixed on Mrs. Garrison's face with that particular intensity he had when someone was in distress. "Can you prove it?" she asked finally. "Not yet, but I'm going to. Archie, call Saul. Then call Inspector Kramer and ask him to come here tomorrow morning. I want to discuss Raymond Fletcher's autopsy report on Thomas Garrison." Kramer's not going to be happy about being dragged into this. Kramer is never happy about being dragged into anything. Call him anyway. I reached for the phone while Mrs. Garrison watched with the expression of someone who'd just had their worst suspicions confirmed. Wolfe picked up his beer glass and stared at it like it contained answers instead of beer. "Mrs. Garrison," he said quietly, "your husband was a good man who discovered something he wasn't supposed to discover. He tried to do the right thing by reporting it to someone he thought could help. Instead, that person betrayed him. We're going to find out why, and we're going to make sure the people responsible for his death answer for it." She nodded slowly. "Thank you. Don't thank me yet. We have a long way to go." I got Saul Panzer on the phone. He was between jobs and available immediately, which was lucky, and explained what we needed. Saul asked 3 questions, quoted his usual rate, and said he'd start surveillance that evening. Then I called Kramer at his office at the homicide squad. "Goodwin," Kramer's voice rumbled through the line. "What does Wolfe want now?" "Your charming company at the Brownstone tomorrow morning. 9 o'clock if that works for you." "It doesn't. I'm busy. This is about a possible murder that was covered up by the medical examiner's office. Wolfe thinks you'll want to hear about it." There was a long pause. "What murder?" "Thomas Garrison. Died 3 weeks ago. Cause of death listed as heart attack. His widow thinks it was poison. Wolfe thinks the deputy medical examiner who signed the death certificate is involved in covering it up. This is going to give me a headache, isn't it?" "Probably. 9 o'clock. I'll be there. And Goodwin, this better not be another one of Wolfe's wild theories." "Would I waste your time with wild theories?" "Yes." He hung up. I reported to Wolfe, who nodded with satisfaction. "Good. We'll present Kramer with what we know and see if he can obtain Fletcher's autopsy report. If Fletcher falsified the cause of death, there will be evidence in his own documentation. And if there isn't, then we'll find it elsewhere. But I suspect Fletcher was lazy or arrogant enough to sign off on a cursory examination without doing proper toxicology work. That laziness will be his undoing." Mrs. Garrison stood up. "What should I do?" "Go home. Wait. If I need anything further from you, Archie will call." Wolfe's expression softened slightly. "Mrs. Garrison, I understand this is difficult, but we're making progress. Your husband's death will not go unanswered." She left, and Fritz showed her out. When the front door closed, I turned to Wolfe. "You really think Fletcher helped murder Garrison?" "I think Fletcher signed a death certificate without performing a proper examination because someone asked him to. Whether he knew Garrison was murdered or simply looked the other way to avoid inconvenience is unclear. But either way, he's complicit. Why would a deputy medical examiner risk his career to help a smuggler? Money, fear, blackmail. The usual reasons people compromise their integrity." Wolfe picked up his book. "We'll know more when Saul reports back. In the meantime, I'm going to read until dinner. Fritz is preparing beef bourguignon." "Of course he is." I spent the rest of the evening typing up notes and organizing the case file, while Wolfe read, and the dogs dozed in their various positions around the office. At 7 we went to the dining room for Fritz's beef bourguignon, which was worth every hour he'd spent preparing it, and at 9 I took a walk around the block to clear my head. Caesar accompanied me. He occasionally liked evening walks, and I'd learned not to argue with a 100-pound Doberman who wanted exercise. The March evening was cold and clear, and the streets of Manhattan hummed with their usual energy. I walked past brownstones and shops, watching the city go about its business, and thought about a dead accountant who'd tried to do the right thing and ended up dead because someone didn't want him asking questions. When I got back to the brownstone, the lights were on in the office. Wolfe had gone up to his room, and the other dogs were settled for the night. I checked the locks, made sure the security chain was in place, and headed upstairs myself. Tomorrow, Inspector Kramer would arrive and hear our theory about Raymond Fletcher. If we were right, we'd have the beginning of a case. If we were wrong, we'd have a lot of explaining to do. But I didn't think we were wrong. Thomas Garrison had discovered something at Margulis Imports that got him killed. Raymond Fletcher had helped cover it up. And somewhere in the connections between a smuggling operation and a corrupt medical examiner was a motive for murder that made sense if we could just figure out what it was. I went to bed with that thought circling in my head like a dog chasing its tail. Sleep came eventually, but it was the restless kind that comes when you know you're close to something important, but haven't quite grasped it yet. The next morning would either bring answers or more questions. With Nero Wolfe, it was usually both. Inspector Kramer arrived at 9 o'clock sharp Saturday morning, which told me he was taking this seriously despite his grumbling on the phone. Fritz showed him in, and Caesar performed his usual inspection at the door. Kramer had been to the brownstone enough times that the dog recognized him and stepped aside without fuss. The other dogs watched from their positions with professional interest. Kramer noticed them the way he always did, with a slight tightening around his eyes that suggested he wasn't entirely comfortable with the idea of 6 trained guard dogs having free run of the ground floor. "They don't bite," I said cheerfully, leading him down the hall to the office. "That's what you said last time." And was I wrong? Not yet. Wolfe was behind his desk with his morning beer and the New York Times spread out in front of him. He looked up when Kramer entered, nodded with minimal courtesy, and gestured toward the red leather chair. Kramer sat, pulled out a cigar, and went through his usual ritual of examining it, biting off the end and lighting it with a wooden match. The smell of tobacco filled the office. "All right, Wolfe, I'm here. What's this about the medical examiner's office covering up a murder?" Wolfe set down his newspaper. 3 weeks ago, a man named Thomas Garrison died at Mount Sinai Hospital. The attending physician diagnosed the cause of death as acute myocardial infarction, a heart attack. The deputy medical examiner, Dr. Raymond Fletcher, performed an autopsy and concurred with that diagnosis. The death certificate lists natural causes. So where's the murder? His widow believes he was poisoned. Mrs. Garrison was a nurse with 6 years' experience at Bellevue. She observed symptoms inconsistent with cardiac arrest, excessive sweating, dilated pupils, tremors, disorientation. She believes those symptoms indicate poisoning, and I've come to agree with her assessment. Kramer blew out smoke. "Lots of widows think their husbands were murdered, Wolfe. Most of them are wrong." "Indeed, but most widows don't have medical training, and most dead husbands don't have professional connections to smuggling operations and suspicious meetings with deputy medical examiners." Wolfe leaned back in his chair. Thomas Garrison was an accountant working for Hartley and Ross. In February, he was auditing the books of a company called Margolis Imports. He discovered discrepancies in their import documentation, merchandise being brought into the country that wasn't appearing in their financial records. When he raised questions about it, the owner complained and had him removed from the account. "That's not murder. That's business." But Garrison didn't stop. After being removed from the account, he tried to contact the owner. He was refused, and on February 10th, he met with Raymond Fletcher. The meeting was marked confidential in his appointment book. That got Kramer's attention. Fletcher? The same Fletcher who signed his death certificate? The very same. Why would an accountant meet with a deputy medical examiner? That, Wolfe said, is the question I asked myself. And the answer, I believe, is that Garrison wanted to report what he'd discovered at Margolis Imports. Not to the police, not to customs officials, but to someone whose jurisdiction covered medical contraband. Smuggling operations that involve pharmaceuticals, drugs, or medical equipment would fall under the purview of the medical examiner's office. Garrison went to Fletcher because he believed Fletcher could investigate the smuggling operation. Kramer chewed on his cigar. "And you think Fletcher killed him?" "I think Fletcher betrayed him. Whether Fletcher personally administered the poison or simply provided it to someone else is unclear. But 3 weeks after that meeting, Thomas Garrison died of symptoms consistent with poisoning, and Fletcher signed a death certificate, claiming natural causes without performing adequate toxicology screening. That's a hell of an accusation, Wolfe. You got any proof?" "Not yet. That's why I asked you here. You have authority to request Fletcher's autopsy report. If he falsified the cause of death, the documentation will show it, either through the absence of proper toxicology work or through inconsistencies in his findings." Kramer studied Wolfe through a haze of cigar smoke. "Let me get this straight. You want me to accuse a deputy medical examiner of murder based on a widow's suspicions, and your theory about a smuggling operation you can't prove exists." "I can prove it exists. Archie has already visited Margolis Imports and confirmed the discrepancies in their documentation. The owner became hostile when questioned about Thomas Garrison and refused to answer any questions. Saul Panzer is currently conducting surveillance on both Margolis and Fletcher. If they're connected, we'll have evidence soon enough." "That's not how this works. You can't just—" Kramer stopped, took the cigar out of his mouth, and pointed it at Wolfe. "You're asking me to investigate a colleague. A city official with a clean record and years of service. You understand what that means? If you're wrong, if this is just a widow's grief and your imagination, I'll be in front of the commissioner explaining why I accused a deputy medical examiner of murder without cause. And if I'm right, Wolfe said quietly, a man was murdered, and his killer is currently working in the city morgue, signing death certificates and conducting autopsies. How many other deaths has Fletcher falsified? How many other murders has he covered up? The office went silent, except for the ticking of the clock on the wall. Loyal, who'd been lying beside my desk, lifted his head and looked at Kramer with that particular intensity he had when he sensed tension. Kramer put the cigar back in his mouth. I'll request the autopsy report. But Wolfe, if this turns out to be nothing, if Garrison died of a heart attack and Fletcher's report is clean, you and I are going to have a serious conversation about wasting police time. Agreed. And if I find evidence that you've been conducting your own investigation without informing the police, we've informed you now. Anything we discover from this point forward will be shared immediately. Kramer didn't look convinced, but he stood up. I'll have the report by Monday. If there's anything irregular in it, we'll talk. Until then, keep your man Panzer on a short leash. I don't want him interfering with a potential police investigation. Saul is the soul of discretion. That's what worries me. Kramer headed for the door, then stopped and turned back. One more thing. If Fletcher is dirty, he's not working alone. Medical examiners don't falsify death certificates for fun. Someone's paying him or pressuring him. You find out who that is, you call me immediately. Understood? Perfectly. Kramer left. I heard Fritz show him out, and a moment later the front door closed. Wolfe picked up his beer and drank. That went well, I said. Kramer is suspicious by nature and cautious by training. It's what makes him good at his job. You think he'll actually request the autopsy report? He'll request it. Whether he'll share it with us is another question. Wolfe set down his glass. Regardless, we proceed. Saul will provide surveillance until Margolis and Fletcher make contact. When they do, we'll have the connection we need. And if they don't make contact, then we'll find another way to connect them. But I don't think that will be necessary. Fletcher is nervous. The medical examiner's office referred all inquiries to the city attorney, which suggests they're expecting legal trouble. And Margolis is nervous. He nearly assaulted you when you mentioned Fletcher's name. Nervous people make mistakes. We simply need to wait for them to make one. The phone rang. I picked it up. Nero Wolfe's office. Archie, it's Saul. His voice was calm, professional, and slightly amused. You wanted a connection? I've got one. Fletcher left his apartment 20 minutes ago and took a cab to a diner on 2nd Avenue. He's currently sitting in a booth with a man who matches the description you gave me of Margolis. I looked at Wolfe. Saul says Fletcher and Margolis are having breakfast together at a diner on 2nd Avenue. Wolfe's eyebrows rose. Excellent. Tell Saul to observe but not approach. I want to know how long they meet, whether they exchange anything, and where they go afterward. I relayed the instructions. Saul said, Understood. I'll call back when they separate. I hung up and turned to Wolfe. So they are connected. It would appear so. The question now is whether they're meeting because Fletcher is helping Margolis smuggle contraband, or because they're both concerned about our investigation. Could be both. Indeed, Wolfe picked up his newspaper. We wait for Saul's report. In the meantime, I have correspondence to review, and you have filing to do. I spent the next 2 hours organizing case files and typing letters, while Wolfe read, and the dogs dozed. At 11:30 the phone rang again. It was Saul. They met for 45 minutes. Fletcher did most of the talking. Margolis looked unhappy. When they left, Fletcher went back to his apartment, and Margolis returned to his office. No exchange of documents or money that I could see, but they were definitely arguing about something. Could you hear what they were saying? Not clearly, but I got close enough to catch a few words. Fletcher said something about the widow and questions. Margolis said something about handling it and keeping quiet. Then Fletcher said, and this is interesting, I can't sign another one. Margolis said something I didn't catch, and Fletcher shook his head and walked out. I repeated that to Wolfe, whose expression became very still. I can't sign another one, he murmured. Another death certificate. Fletcher is refusing to falsify another cause of death, so Margolis is planning another murder, or threatening one, or has already committed one, and wants Fletcher's cooperation in covering it up. Wolfe's eyes narrowed. Archie, call Kramer immediately. Tell him what Saul observed and tell him we need that autopsy report now, not Monday. If Fletcher is balking at falsifying another death certificate, it suggests he's already falsified at least one, Thomas Garrison's. I called Kramer's office. The detective who answered said he was out on a case and wouldn't be back until afternoon. I left a message marked urgent and hung up. He's not available. Then we proceed without him. Call Saul and have him continue surveillance on both Fletcher and Margolis. If either of them makes another move, I want to know immediately. I made the call. Saul acknowledged and said he'd split his time between the two locations. When I hung up, Wolfe was staring at his desk with the expression he gets when he's working through a problem that doesn't have obvious solutions. What are you thinking? I'm thinking, Wolfe said slowly, that we need to accelerate this investigation before Margolis panics and Fletcher decides his cooperation isn't worth the risk. If Fletcher refuses to sign another false death certificate, Margolis loses his protection. That makes him dangerous, and desperate men do reckless things. Like what? Like eliminating witnesses, like destroying evidence, like coming after the people asking questions. Wolfe looked at me. Mrs. Garrison is in danger, Archie. If Margolis believes she's the driving force behind our investigation, he may decide to silence her the same way he silenced her husband. I sat up straight. You think he'd go after her? I think it's a possibility we can't ignore. Call her immediately. Tell her to come here and stay here until this is resolved. If she balks, explain that her safety may depend on it. I grabbed the phone and dialed Mrs. Garrison's number. It rang 6 times before she answered, her voice breathless like she'd been running. Mrs. Garrison, it's Archie Goodwin. Are you all right? Yes, I'm fine. I was in the garden. What's wrong? Mr. Wolfe wants you to come to the brownstone and stay here for a few days. We have reason to believe you might be in danger. Danger? From whom? From the person who killed your husband. We've made progress on the case, but that progress has made certain people nervous. Mr. Wolfe thinks it would be safer if you were here where we can keep an eye on you. There was a long pause. You really think someone would? I think we'd rather be cautious than sorry. Can you come now? Yes. Yes, I'll pack a bag and take a cab. Good. We'll see you soon. I hung up and reported to Wolfe. He nodded with satisfaction. Fritz will prepare the guest room. She'll be safe here. You really think Margolis would try to kill her? I think Margolis has already killed once and gotten away with it, because Raymond Fletcher signed a death certificate saying it was natural causes. Now Fletcher is refusing to provide that protection again. That leaves Margolis exposed and vulnerable. If he believes Mrs. Garrison is the reason we're investigating, eliminating her would solve his problem. Except now we're investigating too, which is why you'll be armed until this is over, and why the dogs will remain on alert. Wolfe looked toward the hall, where Caesar was visible near the front door. I paid a considerable sum for bulletproof windows and a reinforced door. I don't intend to test their effectiveness, but I'm glad we have them. Mrs. Garrison arrived 40 minutes later, carrying an overnight bag and looking pale but determined. Fritz showed her upstairs to the guest room, and when she came back down, I installed her in the front room with a cup of Fritz's coffee and instructions not to go outside without telling me first. I feel ridiculous, she said, hiding in your house like a fugitive. You're not hiding, you're staying somewhere safe while we finish what your husband started. I sat down across from her. Mrs. Garrison, we're close to proving your husband was murdered. Saul Panzer observed Raymond Fletcher and Margolis meeting this morning. They were arguing about something, and Fletcher said he couldn't sign another one, meaning another false death certificate. That suggests Fletcher falsified your husband's death certificate, and Margolis is asking him to do it again. Her hands tightened around the coffee cup. For whom? We don't know yet. But whoever it is, Margolis thinks they need to die, and he needs Fletcher's help to make it look like natural causes. Fletcher is refusing. That makes Margolis desperate, and desperate people are dangerous. She looked down at her coffee. Thomas was just trying to do the right thing. He found something wrong, and he tried to report it, and they killed him for it. Yes, and we're going to make sure they answer for it. I stood up. Stay here. Fritz will bring you lunch. If you need anything, just ask him. I returned to the office, where Wolfe was on the phone with someone who sounded like he was being cooperative under duress. When Wolfe hung up, he looked satisfied. That was the director of the medical examiner's office. Inspector Kramer filed an official request for Fletcher's autopsy report on Thomas Garrison. The director is reviewing it personally and will deliver his findings to Kramer Monday morning. Monday's too long. If Margolis is planning something, Monday is adequate. Margolis doesn't know we're protecting Mrs. Garrison. He'll spend the weekend trying to decide what to do and working up the courage to act. We'll spend the weekend building our case and preparing for his next move. The phone rang again. I picked it up. It was Saul. Fletcher just left his apartment again. He's heading toward Margolis Imports on foot. Looks agitated. I repeated that to Wolfe. He frowned. Tell Saul to follow but stay out of sight. If Fletcher confronts Margolis, we need to know what they discuss. I relayed the message and hung up. This is getting interesting fast. Indeed, Fletcher is either going to threaten Margolis or warn him. Either way, it suggests our investigation has made them both nervous enough to risk meeting in daylight. Wolfe leaned back in his chair. Archie, make sure the doors are locked and the dogs are alert. If Margolis decides to act rashly, I'd prefer to have warning. I checked the front door, locked, chain in place, and the back door leading to the garden, both secure. The dogs were already distributed strategically around the ground floor. Caesar near the front entrance, Mars by the office door, Apollo watching the hallway, Minerva in the kitchen with Fritz, Diana near the stairs, and Loyal at my desk. They knew something was happening, and their attention was sharp. Outside, the March afternoon continued cold and grey. Inside, we waited for the next move in a game that was starting to look a lot like chess. And we weren't the only ones playing. Sunday morning brought rain and Saul Panzer's report. He called at 8:30 while Wolfe and I were having breakfast. Fritz's blueberry pancakes with real maple syrup, which I mentioned because it's important to appreciate excellence when you find it. And his voice carried the calm satisfaction of someone who'd spent a productive night watching other people make mistakes. Fletcher went to Margolis Imports yesterday afternoon. I couldn't get close enough to hear the conversation, but I could see them through the office window. They argued for 20 minutes. Fletcher was angry. Lots of hand gestures, raised voice. Margolis looked scared. When Fletcher left, he was carrying an envelope. I followed him back to his apartment. He stayed in for the night. I repeated that to Wolfe, who paused with his fork halfway to his mouth. An envelope. Papers, presumably. Either documentation of the smuggling operation, or evidence that Fletcher wants to distance himself from Margolis. Or payment, I suggested. Margolis buying Fletcher's silence. Possible. But Fletcher's body language suggests he's angry, not cooperative. Angry men don't accept payment easily. They demand explanations. Wolfe set down his fork. Saul, continue surveillance. I want to know if Fletcher leaves his apartment today, and where he goes. I relayed the message. Saul said he'd already positioned himself across the street from Fletcher's building and would call back if anything changed. Mrs. Garrison came down to breakfast a few minutes later, looking like she'd slept poorly but was determined not to show it. Fritz brought her coffee and pancakes, and she ate with the careful attention of someone doing something familiar to maintain their grip on reality. Any news? She asked. Fletcher and Margolis met yesterday. They argued. Fletcher left with an envelope. We don't know what was in it yet, but Saul's watching to see if Fletcher makes another move. When will Inspector Kramer have the autopsy report? Tomorrow morning. The director of the medical examiner's office is reviewing it personally. She nodded slowly. What happens if the report shows Thomas died of a heart attack? If there's no evidence of poisoning? Wolfe looked up from his pancakes. Then we'll find the evidence another way. Autopsy reports can be falsified. Toxicology screens can be incomplete. But the truth has a way of emerging eventually, particularly when people who know it become frightened and angry. You mean Fletcher? I mean Fletcher. He's the weak link. Margolis is ruthless and calculating, but Fletcher is a professional who compromised his integrity for reasons we don't yet understand. Now he's being asked to compromise it again, and he's refusing. That refusal suggests a conscience limited perhaps, but present. Consciences can be exploited. How? By offering him a way out. If Fletcher believes he can save himself by testifying against Margolis, he may take it. But first we need proof that he falsified your husband's death certificate. That's what Kramer will provide tomorrow. The phone rang. I picked it up. It was Saul again. Fletcher just left his building. He's carrying a briefcase. Walking south on foot. Stay with him. I covered the mouthpiece and looked at Wolfe. Fletcher's on the move with a briefcase. Wolfe's eyes narrowed. Tell Saul to maintain surveillance and report his destination immediately. 20 minutes later, Saul called back. "You're not going to believe this. Fletcher just walked into the 20th precinct. He's still inside." I looked at Wolfe. Fletcher went to a police station. Wolfe sat very still. "Which one?" "The 20th precinct." "That's Kramer's jurisdiction. Fletcher is turning himself in." Wolfe pushed back from the table and stood up. "Call Kramer immediately. Tell him Raymond Fletcher is at the 20th precinct and may be attempting to confess. We need to be there before Fletcher changes his mind." I grabbed the phone and dialed Kramer's home number. He answered on the third ring, sounding annoyed at being called on Sunday morning. "This better be important, Goodwin. Raymond Fletcher just walked into the 20th precinct, carrying a briefcase. Saul Panzer followed him there. We think he's trying to confess." There was a pause, then the sound of Kramer swearing creatively. "I'm on my way. Don't you dare go to that precinct without me. Wouldn't dream of it." He hung up. I turned to Wolfe. "Kramer's coming here first. He wants to go to the precinct together. Sensible. He'll want to ensure Fletcher's statement is properly documented and that we're present to provide context." Wolfe looked at Mrs. Garrison. "You'll remain here with Fritz. If Fletcher is confessing, this may be over sooner than anticipated." She stood up. "I want to come with you." "No. If Fletcher is being coerced or manipulated, your presence could compromise his statement. You'll wait here." Wolfe's tone left no room for argument. "Fritz will look after you. The dogs will ensure no one enters who shouldn't." Kramer arrived 30 minutes later in an unmarked car, accompanied by Sergeant Pearlie Stebbins. They came into the brownstone with the focused intensity of cops on a case that had suddenly gotten interesting. Caesar inspected Kramer at the door, recognized him, stepped aside, and we headed to the office. "All right, Wolfe, tell me everything you know about Fletcher and Margolis." Wolfe did, efficiently and without embellishment. Thomas Garrison's discovery of discrepancies at Margolis Imports, his meeting with Fletcher on February 10th, his death 3 weeks later, Fletcher's refusal to discuss the case, and Saul's surveillance showing Fletcher and Margolis meeting multiple times and arguing. When he finished, Kramer looked like a man who'd just had his worst suspicions confirmed. "You're telling me a deputy medical examiner falsified a death certificate to cover up a murder for a smuggler?" "That's my theory, yes." "And you think Fletcher's at the precinct right now, ready to confess?" "I think Fletcher realized he's in over his head and wants a way out. Whether he'll confess fully or simply claim he made an error in his autopsy is unclear. But his presence at a police station with a briefcase suggests he's brought documentation." Kramer stood up. "Let's go find out. Stebbins, you're driving. Goodwin, you and Wolfe are with me. And if this turns out to be a waste of time, it won't be," Wolfe said. We took Kramer's car to the 20th precinct, a square brick building on West 82nd Street that looked like every police station in New York, functional, unwelcoming, and vaguely threatening. Inside, the desk sergeant directed us to an interview room on the second floor, where a detective named Morrison was sitting across from Raymond Fletcher taking notes. Fletcher looked terrible. He was maybe 55, gray-haired, with the pinched exhaustion of someone who hadn't slept in days. His suit was rumpled, his tie was loose, and his hands were trembling slightly as he held a cup of coffee. The briefcase sat on the table in front of him, open, with papers visible inside. Morrison looked up when we entered. "Inspector, these people with you?"
"Yeah. What's Fletcher saying?"
"He's confessing to falsifying a death certificate. Thomas Garrison died March 2nd. Fletcher says he certified the cause of death as heart attack without performing adequate toxicology screening. Says he did it because someone paid him to." Kramer looked at Fletcher. "Who paid you?" Fletcher's voice was hoarse. "Margolis. Daniel Margolis, owner of Margolis Imports. He approached me in February, said he had a problem that needed to be handled quietly. He offered me $10,000 to sign off on a death certificate without asking questions. $10,000 to cover up a murder. I didn't know it was murder. He said it was a business associate who died suddenly, and there might be questions from the family. He said he wanted to avoid an investigation that could damage his business." I thought Fletcher stopped, rubbed his face. "I thought it was just a favor. Sign the certificate, take the money, forget about it." "But it wasn't just a favor," Wolfe said from the doorway. Fletcher looked up and saw us. His expression went from exhausted to panicked. "Who are you?" "Nero Wolfe. This is my associate, Archie Goodwin. We've been investigating Thomas Garrison's death on behalf of his widow." Tell me, Dr. Fletcher, did you examine Garrison's body? I? Yes. Briefly, there were no obvious signs of trauma. The hospital report said heart attack. I confirmed it, without toxicology screening. Margolis said it wasn't necessary. He said the cause of death was obvious, and any delays would upset the family. And you believed him. Fletcher's hands tightened around his coffee cup. I wanted to believe him. $10,000 is a lot of money, Mr. Wolfe. I have gambling debts. I made some bad decisions at racetracks. Margolis knew about them. He said he could help. So he blackmailed you. He gave me a choice. Take the money and sign the certificate, or refuse and have my debts become public knowledge. I chose the money. Fletcher's voice cracked. I didn't know Garrison was murdered. I swear I didn't know. But you suspected, not at first. But when Garrison's widow started asking questions, and when you PC, he looked at me, showed up at my office asking about the case, I started wondering. Then Margolis came to me yesterday and asked me to do it again. Another death certificate, another body, same arrangement. And I realized what I'd done. I realized I'd helped cover up a murder. Kramer leaned against the wall. Who's the other body? I don't know. Margolis wouldn't tell me. He just said he needed my help one more time, that it would be the last time, that I could walk away clean if I just signed one more certificate. Fletcher looked at his hands. I couldn't do it. I've spent 30 years in this profession. I've examined thousands of bodies. I've testified in hundreds of cases. I'm not a murderer. I'm not. He stopped, his voice breaking entirely. Wolfe moved into the room and sat down across from Fletcher. The dogs had stayed in the car with Stebbins, but their absence didn't make Wolfe any less intimidating. He studied Fletcher with the cold assessment of someone deciding whether a man deserved mercy or contempt. Dr. Fletcher, you have a choice now. You can confess fully, provide all documentation related to Thomas Garrison's death, and testify against Margolis. Or you can claim ignorance, insist you made an innocent mistake, and hope the district attorney believes you. Which will it be? Fletcher looked at the papers in his briefcase. I brought everything. The payment records, the notes from my conversation with Margolis, the autopsy report on Garrison. It's all here, including evidence that Garrison was poisoned. I didn't perform adequate toxicology screening, so I don't have proof of poisoning, but I reviewed the hospital records after your assistant came to my office. The symptoms described by the attending physician are consistent with acute poisoning, possibly an alkaloid or cardiac glycoside. If a proper toxicology screen had been performed, it would have shown up. Can such a screen still be performed? Fletcher nodded slowly. If Garrison's body is exhumed and tissue samples are analyzed, yes. Certain poisons leave traces in bone, hair, or preserved organs even weeks after death. Kramer pushed off the wall. All right, Fletcher, you're under arrest for falsifying official documents and obstruction of justice. Morrison, get this all documented and call the DA's office. Tell them we need an exhumation order for Thomas Garrison immediately. He looked at Wolfe. Satisfied? Not yet. We still need to arrest Margolis for murder. We don't have proof he killed Garrison. We will once the toxicology results come back. In the meantime, you have Fletcher's testimony that Margolis paid him to falsify the death certificate. That's conspiracy and obstruction at minimum. Kramer nodded grimly. Stebbins and I will pick up Margolis this afternoon. You and Goodwin go home and let us handle this. Agreed. But I'd like to be present when you question him. Not a chance. Then I'd like a full report of his statement. Also not a chance. Kramer pulled out a cigar. Wolfe, you did good work on this. But it's a police matter now. We'll take it from here. Wolfe stood up. Very well. Archie, we're leaving. We went back downstairs, collected the dogs from Stebbins's car. They'd been patient, but were clearly ready to stretch their legs, and took a cab back to the brownstone. Mrs. Garrison was waiting in the front room, and when we told her what had happened, she went very still. Fletcher confessed. He confessed to falsifying your husband's death certificate. He claims Margolis paid him $10,000 to sign off on heart attack without performing adequate toxicology screening. Kramer is obtaining an exhumation order. Once the toxicology results confirm poisoning, they'll charge Margolis with murder. So it's over. Almost. The legal proceedings will take months, but the essential work is done. Your husband's death will be officially ruled a homicide, and the people responsible will be prosecuted. She sat down slowly. Thomas tried to do the right thing. He found something wrong, and he tried to report it. And they killed him for it. Yes. But Fletcher's confession means his death won't be in vain. The smuggling operation will be shut down. Margolis will be convicted. Justice will be served. Wolfe's tone softened slightly. It's not a perfect resolution. Your husband is still dead. But at least now the world will know he died trying to protect it from criminals. She nodded, unable to speak. I offered her coffee, which she declined, and Fritz brought her a glass of water instead. We sat in silence for a few minutes, the weight of the case settling over us like fog. Finally, Mrs. Garrison looked up. What was Margolis smuggling? We don't know yet. The police will determine that during their investigation. But Fletcher implied it was something medical, pharmaceuticals, possibly, or controlled substances. Whatever it was, Thomas Garrison discovered it and threatened to expose it, and for that they murdered him. Yes. She stood up. I should go home. There are arrangements to make. The exhumation, the reinvestigation, the funeral. You can stay here as long as you need, I said. Thank you. But I'd rather be home. It's time to start whatever comes next. Fritz called her a cab, and I walked her to the door. Caesar accompanied us, giving her a final inspection before she left. When she was gone, I returned to the office, where Wolfe was back at his desk with a book. You think Kramer will get Margolis? Undoubtedly. Margolis is a businessman, not a criminal mastermind. When confronted with Fletcher's testimony and the exhumation order, he'll either confess or retain an expensive attorney who will negotiate a plea arrangement. Wolfe turned a page. Either way, Mrs. Garrison will have her answers, and her husband's reputation restored. That too. I sat at my desk and started typing up notes for the case file. Outside, the March afternoon continued its wet, grey existence. Inside, the brownstone settled back into its usual rhythms, Fritz in the kitchen preparing dinner, the dogs distributed around the ground floor, Wolfe reading about Byzantine tax policy or orchid cultivation or whatever else caught his interest. The case was essentially over. Thomas Garrison's murder would be confirmed. Raymond Fletcher would testify against Daniel Margolis, and justice would grind forward with its usual slow inevitability. But something still bothered me. Fletcher had said Margolis asked him to falsify another death certificate. For whom and why had Margolis needed a second victim? I was about to ask Wolfe about it when the phone rang. I picked up. It was Kramer. Goodwin. We've got a problem. Margolis is dead. I sat up straight. What? We went to his office to arrest him. Found him at his desk with a bullet in his head. Suicide looks like. Gun in his hand. Note on the desk. Says he couldn't face trial and prison. When did this happen? Medical examiner says within the last 2 hours. We missed him by maybe 30 minutes. I looked at Wolfe. Margolis is dead. Suicide. Kramer says they found him at his desk with a gun and a note. Wolfe's expression didn't change, but his eyes narrowed. Convenient. That's what I thought. I spoke into the phone. Kramer, who's handling the scene? My team. Why? Because if Margolis was about to be arrested for murder and suddenly turns up dead, that's awfully convenient timing. You sure it's suicide? Guns in his hand. Powder burns on his temple. No signs of struggle. Notes in his handwriting. Yeah, it's suicide. What's the note say? I can't live with what I've done. I'm sorry. That's it. I repeated that to Wolfe, who frowned. Ask Kramer who the medical examiner is. I asked. Kramer said, not Fletcher, if that's what you're worried about. Fletcher's in custody. This is being handled by the chief medical examiner personally. No chance of falsification. All right, keep us informed. I hung up and turned to Wolfe. Margolis is dead, probably suicide, but the timing's suspicious. Indeed. Fletcher confesses. We obtain an exhumation order, and within hours Margolis is dead before he can be questioned. Wolfe leaned back in his chair. Either he killed himself to avoid prosecution, or someone killed him to ensure his silence. Who would kill him? Someone else involved in the smuggling operation. Someone who feared Margolis would confess and implicate them. Wolfe's eyes were calculating. Archie, call Saul. I want him to review the security around Margolis imports. If this was murder, someone entered that office, killed Margolis, staged the suicide, and left without being seen. That requires skill and planning. I called Saul and explained the situation. He said he'd head to Margolis imports immediately and report back. When I hung up, Wolfe was staring at his desk with the expression he gets when a case he thought was finished suddenly sprouts new complications. "We're not done, are we?" I said. "No, we're not done." He picked up his beer glass. "Thomas Garrison discovered a smuggling operation. Raymond Fletcher helped cover up his murder. Daniel Margolis commissioned that murder. But someone else is involved. Someone with enough at stake to kill Margolis rather than risk him talking. We need to find out who." "How?" "By determining what Margolis was smuggling and who his partners were." Fletcher said it was something medical. "The police will inventory Margolis imports and determine what contraband they find. When they do, we'll know who else might be involved." The phone rang again. This time it was Saul, calling from a payphone near Margolis imports. "The police have the place locked down. Crime scene unit is inside. I talked to one of the uniforms guarding the door. He said they found boxes of pharmaceuticals in the back office. Morphine, cocaine hydrochloride, barbiturates, all of it labeled as medical supplies from European manufacturers. No import documentation, no custom stamps. Looks like Margolis was smuggling prescription drugs and selling them on the black market." I repeated that to Wolfe. He nodded slowly. "Prescription drugs. Easily sold, highly profitable, and sufficiently dangerous to warrant murder if the operation was threatened. But who was buying them? Hospitals, pharmacies, individual doctors? Possibly. But smuggling operations of that scale usually have a single large buyer, someone who can move volume and pay in cash." Wolfe thought for a moment. "Ask Saul if the police found any records in Margolis's office. Ledgers, correspondence, anything that might indicate who his customers were." I called Saul back. He said the police had removed several boxes of papers and were still cataloguing the evidence. He'd try to get more information but couldn't promise anything. When I hung up, Wolfe was paging through his desk calendar with a thoughtful expression. "Archie, when did Thomas Garrison meet with Raymond Fletcher?" "February 10th. "And when did Hartley and Ross remove him from the Margolis account?" I checked my notes. "Mid-February. The receptionist said about 3 weeks before he died. So Garrison met with Fletcher first, then was removed from the account. That suggests Fletcher didn't help Garrison. He warned Margolis that Garrison was asking questions, which means Fletcher was involved from the beginning." "Yes, he wasn't merely covering up a murder. He was protecting a smuggling operation he had a financial stake in. The $10,000 he received wasn't payment for falsifying a death certificate. It was his share of the profits." I stared at him. "You think Fletcher was Margolis's partner?" "I think Fletcher provided medical expertise and official cover, while Margolis handled logistics and distribution. Together they smuggled prescription drugs into the country and sold them to buyers who didn't ask questions. When Thomas Garrison discovered the discrepancies in Margolis's books, he went to Fletcher for help, not knowing Fletcher was part of the operation. Fletcher warned Margolis. Margolis had Garrison killed, and Fletcher signed the death certificate to cover it up. And now Margolis is dead. Which suggests Fletcher isn't the senior partner. Someone else is calling the shots. Someone who decided Margolis was a liability and eliminated him." The phone rang. I was getting tired of answering it, but I picked up anyway. It was Kramer, and he sounded grim. "Goodwin, tell Wolfe we found something in Margolis's office he needs to hear about. Purchase orders for prescription drugs, all of them going to the same buyer, Metropolitan Hospital Supply Company. Ever heard of them?" "No. Neither had we until we looked them up. Turns out they're a medical supply distributor with contracts to half the hospitals in Manhattan. If Margolis was supplying them with black market pharmaceuticals, we're talking about a major operation, millions of dollars over multiple years." I repeated that to Wolfe. His expression went very still. "Ask Kramer who owns Metropolitan Hospital Supply." I asked. Kramer said, "We're working on that. Corporate records show it's owned by a holding company, which is owned by another holding company. The DA's office is untangling it now. But Goodwin, if this goes where I think it's going, we're not just talking about smuggling. We're talking about organized crime." "Wonderful. Keep us informed." I hung up and looked at Wolfe. "This is getting bigger than just Margolis and Fletcher." "Yes, and more dangerous." Wolfe stood up. "Archie, call Saul and have him come here immediately. I want everyone under this roof until we know who we're dealing with. And call Mrs. Garrison. Tell her to stay home, lock her doors and answer questions for no one. If organized crime is involved, anyone connected to this investigation is at risk." I made the calls. Saul said he'd be there in 20 minutes. Mrs. Garrison said she'd do as instructed. When I hung up, Wolfe was standing at the window, looking out at the street with the dogs arrayed behind him. Caesar at his side, the others watching from their positions around the room. "You think someone's going to come after us?" "I think someone already killed Margolis to keep him quiet. If they believe we know enough to threaten their operation, they may decide we're next." He turned from the window. "We have bulletproof glass, reinforced doors, and 6 trained guard dogs. We're as safe here as anywhere, but I'd prefer not to test those defenses unless absolutely necessary." "Agreed." Fritz appeared in the doorway. "Gentlemen, dinner is ready. Shall I serve it in the dining room, or would you prefer trays in the office?" Wolfe considered. "The office. We'll remain here until Saul arrives and Kramer reports back." Fritz nodded and disappeared. Loyal padded over to my desk and sat down, his attention fixed on my face with that particular intensity that meant he sensed something was wrong. I scratched behind his ears and he leaned into it, his solid warmth reassuring in a way that logic couldn't quite manage. Outside, the March evening faded into darkness. Inside, we waited for the next development in a case that had started with a widow's grief and was now threatening to expose a criminal network that reached into hospitals, supply companies, and possibly the city government itself. Thomas Garrison had tried to do the right thing and died for it. Raymond Fletcher had confessed and was in custody. Daniel Margolis was dead. Suicide or murder, we still weren't sure. And somewhere out there, someone was running a smuggling operation worth millions of dollars and was willing to kill to protect it. Finding out who that someone was and stopping them before they killed anyone else was going to take everything Nero Wolfe had, and probably more than a little luck. But if there's one thing I'd learned working for Wolfe, it's that he doesn't believe in luck. He believes in facts, logic, and relentless pressure applied to the right people at the right time. The smugglers, whoever they were about to learn what that pressure felt like. And I had a feeling they weren't going to enjoy the lesson. Saul Panzer arrived at 6:30, slipping through the front door with the quiet efficiency that made him the best operative in New York. Caesar inspected him at the entrance, recognized him from previous cases, stepped aside, and Saul came into the office carrying a manila folder and wearing the thoughtful expression of someone who'd spent the afternoon putting pieces together. "You've been busy," Wolfe observed from behind his desk, where Fritz had just delivered roast chicken with herbs, potatoes, and green beans that smelled like they'd been grown in heaven's garden. "So have you, from what I hear." Saul sat in the red leather chair and opened his folder. "I did some checking on Metropolitan Hospital Supply Company. Interesting outfit. They've been operating for 8 years, supplying pharmaceuticals and medical equipment to 23 hospitals in Manhattan and the outer boroughs. On paper, they look legitimate. Proper licenses, tax filings, insurance bonds. But their pricing is unusual." "How so?" I asked around a mouthful of chicken. "They undercut every other supplier by 15 to 20%. That's enough to win contracts, but not so much that it raises red flags. Most hospital administrators assume they're getting volume discounts or efficiency savings. But the math doesn't work. There's no way a legitimate supplier can offer those prices and still turn a profit unless their product costs are artificially low. Because they're buying smuggled pharmaceuticals from people like Margolis," Wolfe said. "Exactly. Margolis brings in drugs from Europe without paying import duties or going through FDA approval. Metropolitan buys them at black market prices, marks them up to just below legitimate wholesale, and sells them to hospitals that think they're getting a good deal. Everyone profits except the hospitals, who don't know they're receiving contraband." Wolfe set down his fork. "And the patients who are receiving medications of uncertain quality and provenance. That too." Saul pulled out a sheet of paper. I pulled Metropolitan's corporate registration. The company is owned by something called Apex Holdings LLC, which is owned by Sheridan Investments, which is owned by a trust registered in Delaware. The beneficial owner is hidden behind 3 layers of corporate entities, but I made some calls to people who know people, and the name that keeps coming up is Nathaniel Collier. Who is Nathaniel Collier? Businessman, 62 years old. Made his fortune in real estate and hospital administration. Currently serves on the board of directors for 5 hospitals in Manhattan, including Mount Sinai. I stopped chewing. Mount Sinai, where Thomas Garrison died, and where Dr. Brennan diagnosed heart attack without questioning the symptoms. Wolfe's eyes narrowed. "Saul, does Collier have any connection to Raymond Fletcher?" Saul flipped through his folder. "Not directly, but Collier sits on the board of the Medical Society of New York, which oversees professional standards for physicians and medical examiners in the city. Fletcher would have been subject to their oversight, which gives Collier influence over Fletcher's career. Wolfe leaned back in his chair. A medical examiner with gambling debts would be vulnerable to pressure from someone with that kind of institutional power. Fletcher falsifies a death certificate. Collier ensures there are no professional consequences. A simple arrangement. Until we started asking questions, I said, yes. Our investigation threatened to expose Fletcher, which threatened to expose Margolis, which threatened to expose Metropolitan Hospital Supply, which threatened to expose Collier. So Collier eliminated the weakest link, Margolis, and is hoping the rest of us will stop digging. That's a lot of hoping for a smart man, indeed, which suggests Collier is either desperate or arrogant. Possibly both. Wolfe looked at Saul. Can you prove Collier owns Metropolitan Hospital Supply? Not definitively. The corporate structures are designed to hide that, but I can prove the connection circumstantially. Documents showing money flowing from Metropolitan to Apex to Sheridan to the Delaware Trust, plus Collier's board positions at hospitals that buy from Metropolitan, plus his influence over medical examiners through the Medical Society. It's enough to interest a prosecutor. It's not enough to convict. No. For that we need direct evidence. Documents showing Collier knew about the smuggling operation. Communications between Collier and Margolis or Fletcher. Financial records proving Collier profited from illegal drug sales. That kind of evidence would be in Collier's possession, not ours. The phone rang. I picked it up. It was Kramer, and he sounded like he'd been chewing on broken glass. Goodwin, the DA just called. They finished tracing Metropolitan Hospital Supply's ownership. It goes through 3 holding companies and ends at a Delaware trust. The trustee is a law firm that won't disclose the beneficial owner without a court order, which we're not going to get without probable cause. We're stuck. We know who owns it. I said, Nathaniel Collier, real estate and hospital administration, sits on multiple hospital boards including Mount Sinai. There was a long pause. How do you know that? Saul Panzer did some digging. Collier's name keeps coming up in connection with Metropolitan, and he has the means, motive and connections to run a smuggling operation. That's not evidence, Goodwin. That's speculation. It's a starting point. You investigate Collier, you'll find the evidence. I can't investigate a board member of 5 major hospitals without probable cause. The commissioner would have my badge, even if that board member is running a smuggling operation that's supplying black market drugs to those same hospitals. Especially then. You have any idea what kind of political pressure I'd be under? Collier has friends in City Hall, friends in Albany, probably friends in Washington. I go after him without ironclad proof I'm finished. I looked at Wolfe, who nodded slightly. Kramer, what if we get you that proof? Would you act on it? If you can prove Collier is behind Metropolitan Hospital Supply and knew about the smuggling operation, yeah, I'll arrest him. But Goodwin, I need documents, recordings, financial records, something a jury can understand, not theories from Saul Panzer's contacts. We'll get it. How? We're working on that. I'll call you back. I hung up and turned to Wolfe. Kramer needs evidence he can use in court. Documents showing Collier knew about the smuggling and profited from it, which will be in Collier's office or residence, not accessible to us legally. Wolfe frowned. Unless we can persuade someone with access to those documents to provide them voluntarily. Like who? Like Fletcher. He dealt with Margolis, who dealt with Metropolitan, which is controlled by Collier. Fletcher must have communicated with someone at Metropolitan about which drugs to approve and which deaths to certify without investigation. If we can get Fletcher to testify about those communications, we can connect him to Metropolitan and Metropolitan to Collier. Fletcher's already in custody. Kramer can question him. Kramer can question him about Margolis's murder. But Fletcher will claim he knew nothing about Metropolitan or Collier. He'll say he dealt only with Margolis, took money for falsifying 1 death certificate, and had no knowledge of a larger operation. That keeps his sentence minimal and protects Collier. I thought about that. So we need to convince Fletcher that protecting Collier is more dangerous than testifying against him. Exactly. If Fletcher believes Collier killed Margolis to silence him, and might kill him next, he'll cooperate to save himself. Wolfe looked at Saul. Where is Fletcher being held? The Tombs, most likely. That's where they take prisoners awaiting arraignment. Can you arrange for Archie to visit him? Officially, no. Unofficially, Saul smiled slightly. I know a guard who owes me a favor. Might cost $50 and a bottle of decent whiskey. Pay it. Archie will visit Fletcher tomorrow morning and explain his situation. If Fletcher wants to live long enough to stand trial, he'll tell us everything he knows about Metropolitan Hospital Supply and Nathaniel Collier. I looked at Wolfe. You think Collier would really kill Fletcher in jail? I think Collier has already killed Margolis, and I think he's ruthless enough to eliminate any other witnesses who might testify against him. Fletcher is in a cell surrounded by other criminals, any one of whom could be bribed to arrange an accident. If Fletcher is intelligent, he's already reached that conclusion, and if he hasn't, then you'll help him reach it. Wolfe turned to Saul. Make the arrangements for tomorrow morning. Early before Fletcher's arraignment, Archie will have perhaps 20 minutes to persuade him. Saul nodded and stood up. I'll make some calls. You'll hear from me tonight. He left. Fritz cleared the dinner dishes and brought coffee, which Wolfe drank while staring at his desk with the expression he gets when he's working through a problem that has too many moving parts. The dogs remained alert around the office. Caesar near the door, Mars by the window, Apollo in the hall, Minerva near Fritz's pantry, Diana at the base of the stairs, and Loyal beside my desk. They knew something was happening, and their vigilance added weight to the sense that we were sitting in a fortress, waiting for an attack that might or might not come. You really think Collier's going to come after us? I asked. I think Collier is going to do whatever he believes is necessary to protect a smuggling operation worth millions of dollars annually. If that means killing a few more people, he's already demonstrated his willingness. We're safer here than anywhere, but I'd prefer not to rely solely on bulletproof glass and guard dogs. What else do we have? We have Fletcher's testimony, once he's persuaded to give it. We have Kramer's investigation, once he has evidence to pursue. And we have the element of surprise. Collier doesn't know yet that we've identified him as the person behind Metropolitan Hospital Supply. When he learns that, he'll either run or attack. We need to be ready for both. The phone rang again. This time it was Saul. It's arranged. Tomorrow morning, 7 o'clock. The guard will let Archie into Fletcher's cell for 20 minutes. He won't be present for the conversation, but he can't stop anyone else from observing. Keep it brief, and don't mention anything you wouldn't want overheard. I acknowledged and hung up. 7 a.m. tomorrow at the Tombs, 20 minutes with Fletcher. Adequate. Wolfe stood up. I'm going to bed. We have a long day ahead of us tomorrow, and I prefer to face it rested. Archie, you'll remain on the ground floor tonight. Sleep in the front room where you can hear if anyone approaches the door. You expecting trouble? I'm expecting caution. There's a difference. He headed for the elevator with his usual ponderous dignity. The dogs watched him go, then settled back into their positions. I went to the front room, where Fritz had already made up the couch with sheets and a blanket, and checked the windows, bulletproof glass intact, curtains drawn. The front door was locked, the chain was in place, and Caesar had positioned himself in the hall where he could see both the door and the office. I stretched out on the couch with my .38 on the side table and tried to sleep. It came eventually, but it was the light kind where you're half aware of every sound, the heating system clicking, the dogs shifting position, the occasional car passing on the street outside. Somewhere around 3 a.m., Loyal padded into the room and lay down beside the couch, his warmth and steady breathing more reassuring than any alarm system. When Fritz's alarm clock went off at 5:30, I was already awake. I showered, dressed, had a quick breakfast of Fritz's coffee and toast, and at 6:30 I was in a cab heading downtown to the Tombs. The Manhattan Detention Complex, everyone calls it the Tombs, is a massive stone building on Center Street that looks like it was designed to crush hope on sight. I gave my name to the guard at the entrance, was directed to wait in a bare room with concrete walls and a metal bench, and 10 minutes later a different guard, the one Saul had bribed, I assumed came to collect me. 20 minutes, he said. Don't pass him anything. Don't take anything from him. Don't touch him. Just talk. Understood. He led me through a maze of corridors that smelled of disinfectant and despair, through 3 locked gates that clanged shut behind us, and finally to a cell block where Raymond Fletcher sat on a cot, looking like a man who'd aged 10 years overnight. The guard unlocked the cell. 20 minutes. I'll be at the end of the hall. He left. I stepped inside, and the door closed behind me with a metallic finality that made my skin crawl. Fletcher looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes. You're Goodwin, the investigator. That's right. What do you want? To save your life. If you're interested. He laughed bitterly. My life's over. I'm going to prison for falsifying a death certificate and obstruction of justice. Best case, I get 10 years. Worst case, they charge me as an accessory to murder and I die in here. That's not the worst case. The worst case is you die in here before your trial, because Nathaniel Collier decides you're a liability and arranges an accident. Fletcher's expression went very still. I don't know what you're talking about. Yes, you do. Collier owns Metropolitan Hospital Supply. Margolis supplied them with smuggled pharmaceuticals. You provided medical certification and made sure inconvenient questions didn't get asked. Thomas Garrison discovered the operation, and you helped kill him. Now Margolis is dead, supposedly suicide, but we both know better, and you're in a cell surrounded by people who'd kill you for a pack of cigarettes if someone paid them enough. I didn't help kill anyone. I falsified one death certificate. That's all. One death certificate covering up a murder committed by a smuggling operation run by one of the most powerful men in New York. You think Collier's going to let you live long enough to testify about that? I leaned against the cell wall. Here's what's going to happen. In a few hours you'll be arraigned. The DA will offer you a deal. Testify against Margolis in exchange for a reduced sentence. You'll take it because you think Margolis is dead and can't contradict you. But the DA doesn't know about Metropolitan Hospital Supply yet. He doesn't know about Collier. And when he finds out, he's going to want your testimony about all of it. That's when Collier decides you're too dangerous to keep alive. Fletcher's hands were shaking. I can't testify against Collier. You don't understand who he is. He has influence everywhere. Judges, prosecutors, police. If I testify against him, I'm dead. You're dead if you don't testify. At least this way you have police protection and a chance at a reduced sentence. I moved closer. Fletcher. Margolis trusted Collier. Margolis thought he was valuable enough to keep alive. Look how that worked out. You're not valuable. You're a mid-level bureaucrat who made some bad decisions and got caught. The only reason Collier hasn't killed you yet is because it would be too obvious right after Margolis. Give it a week, maybe 2, and you'll have an accident, fall downstairs, get into a fight with another prisoner, choke on your food. Something plausible enough that nobody looks too closely. What do you want from me? Everything you know about Metropolitan Hospital Supply, who you communicated with, what instructions you received, what other deaths you certified without investigation. Give us enough to connect Collier to the smuggling operation, and we'll make sure the DA knows you cooperated. That gets you protection and a lighter sentence. I communicated with Margolis, nobody else. That's a lie. Margolis didn't have the medical expertise to tell you which deaths to certify and which to investigate. Someone with pharmaceutical knowledge gave you those instructions. Who was it? Fletcher was silent for a long moment. Then he said quietly, Dr. Brennan. I straightened. The attending physician at Mount Sinai? The one who diagnosed Thomas Garrison? Yes, he's on Collier's payroll. He oversees which drugs Metropolitan supplies to Mount Sinai and makes sure no one asks questions about their provenance. When Garrison came in that night with symptoms that might indicate poisoning, Brennan called me and told me to certify heart attack without investigation. He said it was important, that questions would damage Metropolitan's business relationship with the hospital. Did Brennan know Garrison had been murdered? I don't know. He just said to sign the certificate and move on. Fletcher's voice cracked. I thought it was routine. I thought I was just helping avoid an unnecessary investigation. I didn't know Garrison had been poisoned. I didn't know. He stopped, his face crumbling. But you suspected. And you took the money anyway. Yes. Who else is involved? Who else at Mount Sinai knows about Metropolitan smuggled drugs? I don't know. Brennan would know, but he never told me. I just did what I was told and took the payments. How much did they pay you total? 30,000 over 2 years. 10 for Garrison, 20 for other certifications where they wanted me to avoid investigation. What other certifications? Overdoses mostly. Patients who died from adverse reactions to Metropolitan's drugs. Brennan would call and tell me to certify accidental death or medical misadventure without investigating the pharmaceuticals involved. I'd sign off and the hospitals would never know they were using contraband. I stared at him. How many people died? I don't know. 15? 20? I didn't ask questions. I just signed the certificates. He looked at his hands. I'm going to hell, aren't I? Probably. But you can at least try to make it right. You testify about Collier, about Brennan, about everyone involved in this operation, and maybe some good comes out of it. People stop dying from contaminated drugs. Hospitals get cleaned up. Smugglers go to prison. And I get killed. Maybe. Or maybe Collier gets arrested before he can arrange it, and you live long enough to serve your sentence, and eventually get out. I moved toward the cell door. It's your choice, Fletcher. Die in here protecting a man who's already planning your murder, or testify and at least have a chance. What's it going to be? The guard appeared at the end of the hall. Time was up. Fletcher looked at me with the expression of a man standing on the edge of a cliff trying to decide whether to jump. I'll testify, he said finally. Tell the DA I'll testify about everything, but I want protection, real protection, not just a cell and a promise. I'll make sure he knows. The guard unlocked the door, and I stepped out. Behind me, Fletcher sat on his cot, with his head in his hands, a broken man who'd traded his integrity for $30,000 and was now paying a price that would never be fully settled. I left the tombs feeling like I needed a shower, took a cab back to the brownstone, and walked in to find Wolfe at breakfast with Fritz's poached eggs and the Morning Times. Caesar inspected me at the door, accepted me, and I went straight to the office. Fletcher will testify. He's been communicating with Dr. Brennan at Mount Sinai. Brennan's on Collier's payroll, oversees which drugs Metropolitan supplies to the hospital, and told Fletcher to certify Garrison's death as heart attack without investigation. Fletcher also certified 15 to 20 other deaths where patients died from adverse reactions to Metropolitan's contaminated drugs. Wolfe set down his newspaper. Brennan was the attending physician who diagnosed Garrison. Yes, which means he knew exactly what he was looking at when Garrison came in with poisoning symptoms. He called Fletcher and arranged the cover-up before Garrison was even dead, which means Brennan may have known Garrison was going to be poisoned. He may have been part of the planning. Wolfe's expression darkened. Call Kramer. Tell him we have Fletcher's testimony connecting Brennan and Collier to the smuggling operation. Tell him we need arrest warrants for both of them immediately. I reached for the phone just as it started ringing. I picked it up. It was Kramer, and he sounded like someone who'd just had the worst morning of his career. Goodwin, we've got another body. Dr. Brennan. Found dead in his apartment an hour ago. Single gunshot to the head. Gun in his hand. Suicide note on the table. Says he couldn't live with what he'd done. I closed my eyes. It wasn't suicide. Yeah, I figured. Same setup as Margolis. Too convenient. Too clean. Collier's eliminating witnesses. Fletcher's next. I know. I've already ordered protective custody. He's being moved to a secure facility under guard. But Goodwin, we need to move fast. Collier's cleaning house. If we don't get him soon, everyone who can testify against him is going to end up dead. Wolfe says we need arrest warrants for Collier immediately. On what charge? I still don't have direct evidence connecting him to Metropolitan Hospital Supply or the smuggling operation. Fletcher's testimony helps, but a defense attorney will argue Fletcher's lying to save himself. I need documents, financial records, something that proves Collier knew about the drugs and profited from them. I looked at Wolfe, who was listening to my end of the conversation with that calculating expression that meant he was 3 steps ahead of everyone else. Hold on, Kramer, I covered the mouthpiece. He needs evidence connecting Collier to Metropolitan and the smuggling operation, documents or financial records. Wolfe thought for a moment. Ask Kramer if Brennan's apartment has been fully searched. I asked. Kramer said, crime scene units there now? Why? Because if Brennan was on Collier's payroll and managing the drug supply to Mount Sinai, he kept records, financial statements, correspondence, pharmaceutical inventories. Search his office at the hospital and his residence. You'll find what you need. I relayed that. Kramer said, we're on it. I'll call you back. He hung up. I set down the phone and looked at Wolfe. Collier's killed 3 people in 3 days, Margolis, Brennan, and technically Thomas Garrison 2 weeks ago. Though we didn't know it was Collier then. How many more is he planning to kill? As many as necessary to protect himself. Fletcher, Mrs. Garrison, possibly us. Wolfe leaned back in his chair. We're in the final stage now, Archie. Collier knows we're investigating, knows we've connected him to Metropolitan Hospital Supply, knows Fletcher's testimony will expose him. He's eliminating witnesses and evidence as fast as he can. The question is whether we can build a case before he eliminates everyone who matters. And if we can't, then we become targets ourselves. Wolfe's expression was grim. Which is why we're staying in this brownstone, behind bulletproof glass and reinforced doors, with 6 guard dogs and loaded weapons, until Nathaniel Collier is in custody. I didn't survive 40 years in this business by being reckless when cornered criminals get desperate. I checked my 38, made sure it was loaded, and set it on my desk where I could reach it quickly. The dogs sensed the tension. They were all alert now, positioned strategically, watching the doors and windows with professional vigilance. Outside, Monday morning in Manhattan proceeded with its usual oblivious energy. Inside 918 West 35th Street, we waited for Inspector Kramer to find the evidence that would bring down Nathaniel Collier, and we hoped he found it before Collier found us. Kramer called back at 11:30 with the tone of someone who'd just hit the jackpot and wasn't entirely happy about it. We found Brennan's records, ledgers going back 3 years, showing payments from Metropolitan Hospital Supply totaling over $200,000, correspondence with Collier about drug shipments, quality control issues, and which deaths needed to be certified without investigation, financial statements showing Metropolitan's profit margins on smuggled pharmaceuticals. It's all here, Goodwin. Everything we need. I repeated that to Wolfe, whose expression shifted to satisfaction. Excellent. Are you arresting Collier? Kramer's voice came through the phone. That's the problem. Collier's disappeared. He didn't show up for a board meeting at Mount Sinai this morning. His secretary says he called in sick, but when we sent officers to his apartment on Park Avenue, he wasn't there. His housekeeper says he left at 6 a.m. with 2 suitcases. We've got alerts out at airports, train stations and bus terminals, but if he's smart, he's already across state lines using a fake ID. He's not leaving the country, Wolfe said. He's going to ground somewhere local while he decides whether to run or fight. Archie asked Kramer if Collier has family or property outside Manhattan. I asked. Kramer said, "We're checking. His file shows he owns a house in Westchester and an apartment in Boston. We're sending officers to both locations now. What about his movements over the past week? Where has he been?" His calendar shows he was at Mount Sinai Thursday and Friday, a fundraising dinner Saturday night. And Sunday he was supposed to meet with other board members but cancelled. That's the last confirmed sighting. Wolfe leaned forward. Saturday night, a fundraising dinner. Where? Kramer's voice came back. The Plaza Hotel. Annual gala for the Medical Society of New York. Why? Because that's where Collier would have learned about our investigation. Someone at that dinner told him Fletcher had confessed and Margolis was dead. That's when he decided to eliminate Brennan and disappear. Wolfe's eyes narrowed. Who else attended that dinner? I'd have to get the guest list. Hold on. There was rustling of papers. 200 people. Hospital administrators, physicians, donors, board members from half the hospitals in Manhattan. It's going to take time to interview all of them. You don't need to interview all of them. You need to find who Collier spoke with that night and what they discussed. Someone warned him our investigation was getting too close. I'll have my team on it. But Goodwin, even if we find who tipped him off, that doesn't tell us where he is now. Wolfe thought for a moment. Collier is 62 years old, wealthy, accustomed to luxury and control. He's not the type to sleep in cheap motels or hide in warehouses. He'll go somewhere comfortable, somewhere familiar, somewhere he believes is safe. Check his social connections, clubs, private residences, country homes owned by friends or business associates. I heard Kramer writing. All right. Anything else? Yes. Double the guard on Fletcher and Mrs. Garrison. If Collier can't run successfully, he'll try to eliminate the witnesses who can testify against him. Make sure they're protected. Already done. I've got Fletcher in solitary with 2 guards, and Mrs. Garrison has a patrol car outside her building. Nobody's getting to them without going through police officers. Good. Call us when you find Collier. Kramer hung up. Wolfe sat back in his chair with the expression of a man who'd anticipated victory, but wasn't counting on it yet. The dogs remained alert, and I noticed Caesar had positioned himself where he could see both the front door and the office entrance. Tactical awareness that would make a military officer proud. You think Collier's still in the city? I asked. I think he's weighing his options. Run to Europe and live as a fugitive, or stay and try to eliminate the evidence against him. Running requires abandoning his life, his business interests, his reputation. That's difficult for a man of Collier's stature and ego. He'll try to find a way to salvage the situation first, by killing Fletcher and Mrs. Garrison, and possibly Brennan's records, if he can access them, and possibly us, if he believes we're the ones who connected him to Metropolitan Hospital Supply. Wolfe glanced toward the window, where bulletproof glass separated us from the street. We remain here until Collier is in custody. Fritz will prepare lunch. You will keep your weapon accessible, and the dogs will remain on alert. We spent the next 3 hours in a state of controlled tension. Fritz brought lunch sandwiches and soup. Nothing fancy, and we ate in the office rather than the dining room. The phone rang twice. Once was a wrong number. Once was Sol reporting that he'd checked all of Collier's known properties in Manhattan and found nothing. At 2:30 Kramer called again. We found him, or rather, he found us. Collier walked into the 19th precinct 20 minutes ago with his attorney and demanded to speak with me. Says he wants to clear up some misunderstandings about his business relationships. He's going to claim ignorance. Wolfe said when I relayed that. Tell Kramer to be careful. Collier is intelligent and well-connected. He'll have prepared a story that minimizes his involvement. I repeated that. Kramer said, I'm bringing him downtown for questioning. You want to be here? Wolfe considered. No, but I want a full report of everything he says. And Kramer, don't let him post bail. Once he's out, he'll disappear permanently. Keep him in custody until trial. The DA's already on that. Collier's being charged with conspiracy to commit murder, smuggling, racketeering, and about 15 other counts. Bail's going to be set high enough that even his money won't cover it. Good. Call us when the interview is complete. I hung up and looked at Wolfe. He turned himself in. Why would he do that if he's guilty? Because he believes his attorney can create reasonable doubt. Collier will claim he knew nothing about the smuggling operation, that Margolis and Brennan acted independently, that Metropolitan Hospital Supply was a legitimate business he invested in without knowledge of illegal activities. He'll present himself as a victim of subordinates who betrayed his trust. Wolfe picked up his beer glass. It's a plausible defense. Juries are reluctant to believe wealthy, respectable men commit crimes. If Collier's attorney is skilled, he may create enough doubt to avoid conviction. But we have Brennan's records. Financial statements showing Collier profited from smuggled drugs. Correspondence showing he knew about the operation, which Collier will claim was forged or taken out of context. He'll argue Brennan was embezzling from Metropolitan and creating false records to cover his tracks. Without Brennan alive to contradict him, that defense might work. Wolfe set down his glass. The key is Fletcher's testimony. If Fletcher can demonstrate direct communication with Collier about falsifying death certificates, that establishes Collier's knowledge and intent. But Fletcher is a confessed criminal trying to reduce his sentence. A defense attorney will destroy his credibility. So we might lose this case even with all the evidence. We might. Justice is imperfect, and wealthy men hire expensive attorneys who exploit those imperfections. Wolfe's expression was sour, but we've done what we can. We've exposed the smuggling operation, arrested the participants, and given the district attorney everything needed for prosecution. What happens next is beyond our control. The afternoon faded into evening. Fritz prepared dinner, veal piccata that deserved better attention than I gave it, and at 8 o'clock, Kramer called with his report. Collier's sticking to his story. Says he invested in Metropolitan Hospital Supply as a legitimate business venture, had no knowledge of smuggling operations, never communicated with Margolis or Brennan about illegal activities, and is shocked to learn his investment was used for criminal purposes. His attorney is pushing for bail, claiming Collier's not a flight risk and has ties to the community. The DA's arguing for remand based on the murder charges. Judge will rule tomorrow morning. Did Collier explain Brennan's records? Says Brennan was embezzling and creating false documentation to hide it. Claims the correspondence about drug shipments referred to legitimate pharmaceutical supplies and was misinterpreted by us. It's all very smooth and plausible if you ignore the bodies piling up. What about Fletcher's testimony? Collier says Fletcher is lying to save himself. Says he never communicated with Fletcher, never ordered any death certificates falsified, and Fletcher's accusations are desperate fabrications. His attorney is already preparing to attack Fletcher's credibility at trial. Wolfe's voice was cold. Of course he is. Tell the district attorney to review Brennan's records carefully. If Collier claims the correspondence was about legitimate supplies, there should be shipping manifests, customs documentation, FDA approvals. The absence of those documents proves the drugs were smuggled. I repeated that. Kramer said, the DA's already on it. But Goodwin, even with everything we have, this is going to be a tough prosecution. Collier has money, connections, and a skilled defense team. We'll do our best, but I can't promise a conviction. Do what you can. We've done our part. Kramer hung up. I set down the phone and looked at Wolfe. So Thomas Garrison is dead. Margolis is dead. Brennan is dead. Fletcher's going to prison. And Collier might walk away from all of it. He might, or he might spend the rest of his life in prison. We won't know until the trial concludes. Wolfe stood up. But Mrs. Garrison will know her husband was murdered and why. The smuggling operation will be shut down. Hospitals will clean up their supply chains, and perhaps 15 or 20 deaths will be properly investigated, and the families will get answers. That's not nothing, Archie. It's not justice. Justice is what we make of it. We exposed criminals, provided evidence, and gave prosecutors the tools to seek convictions. Whether they succeed is beyond our control. He headed for the elevator. I'm going to bed. Tomorrow we'll close the case and send Mrs. Garrison our bill. You should do the same. He disappeared into the elevator. I sat at my desk for a while longer, thinking about a dead accountant who'd tried to do the right thing and ended up as one more body in a case that might not end with anyone paying the full price for killing him. The dogs settled into their nighttime positions, Caesar near the front door, the others distributed strategically, loyal beside my desk. I checked the locks, made sure my .38 was loaded, and went upstairs to bed. Tomorrow we'd find out if Nathaniel Collier would make bail. Tomorrow we'd close the books on a case that had started with a widow's grief and ended with 3 murders and a smuggling operation worth millions. And tomorrow, maybe we'd learn whether justice was something more than a word rich men's lawyers used to get their clients acquitted. I wasn't holding my breath. Tuesday morning brought unexpected sunshine, and Inspector Kramer's phone call at 8:15, right when Wolfe and I were finishing breakfast. Fritz's sour cherry pancakes deserved better than the conversation we were about to have, but that's how it goes in this business. Judge denied bail, Kramer said without preamble. Collier's being held at Rikers pending trial. His attorney threw a fit, threatened appeals, warned about political consequences. Judge didn't care, said 3 people are dead, and the evidence suggests Collier ordered at least one of those deaths. He's not going anywhere until trial. I repeated that to Wolfe, who nodded with satisfaction. Good. That reduces the immediate danger to Fletcher and Mrs. Garrison. What's the timeline for trial? Kramer's voice came through the phone. DA says 6 months minimum. They're still building the case, tracking down additional evidence, interviewing witnesses. It's going to be complicated. Multiple charges, extensive financial records, medical testimony about contaminated drugs. This isn't going to be quick, but it will proceed. Yeah, it'll proceed. Whether we get a conviction is another question. Collier's attorney is already filing motions to suppress Brennan's records, claiming they were obtained improperly. He's attacking Fletcher's credibility, arguing his testimony is unreliable because he's confessed to crimes and is trying to reduce his sentence. And he's preparing character witnesses who'll testify that Collier is a respected businessman who would never be involved in smuggling or murder. Wolfe's expression was sour. In other words, a standard defense strategy for wealthy criminals. Pretty much, but we've got strong evidence. Brennan's ledgers, correspondence showing Collier knew about the smuggling operation, financial records proving he profited from illegal drug sales. The DA thinks we can get a conviction if the jury sees through Collier's act. Tell the district attorney to subpoena Collier's financial records for the past 5 years. If he was receiving payments from Metropolitan Hospital Supply, there will be traces, deposits, transfers, tax filings. Find the money trail, and you find the proof. I relayed that. Kramer said he'd pass it along, and hung up. Wolfe finished his pancakes in silence, then looked at me. Call Mrs. Garrison. Tell her the case is concluded, and ask her to come here this afternoon to discuss the results. I made the call. Mrs. Garrison answered on the second ring and said she'd be there at 2 o'clock. When I hung up, Wolfe was already heading for the elevator, presumably to spend his morning with the orchids and leave me to handle the paperwork. I spent the next few hours organizing the case file, typing up final reports and preparing the bill. $20,000 as agreed. $10,000 paid in advance, $10,000 due upon resolution. We'd earned every penny, but I still felt like we'd failed somehow. Thomas Garrison was dead. His murderer, assuming it was Collier or someone working for him, might walk away from it. And the widow was left with answers but no real justice. At 2 o'clock, Fritz showed Mrs. Garrison into the office. She looked different somehow, still tired, still grieving, but steadier, like someone who'd been carrying a weight and had finally set it down, even though the marks remained. She took the red leather chair. Wolfe came down from the plant rooms and settled behind his desk. The dogs performed their usual evaluations, Caesar's approval, the other's acceptance, and positioned themselves around the office. Mrs. Garrison, Wolfe began. We have completed our investigation into your husband's death. The results are both conclusive and unsatisfying. Tell me, your husband was murdered. He was poisoned by someone working for or associated with Daniel Margolis, owner of Margolis Imports. The poison was likely administered in food or drink, possibly at his office or during a business meeting. The symptoms you observed, excessive sweating, dilated pupils, tremors, disorientation, were consistent with acute poisoning, probably by a cardiac glycoside or similar substance designed to mimic heart attack. Mrs. Garrison's hands tightened in her lap. Who poisoned him? We don't know for certain. Margolis is dead, killed to prevent him from testifying. Dr. Brennan, the attending physician who diagnosed your husband, is also dead. Raymond Fletcher, the medical examiner who falsified the death certificate, is in custody and has confessed to his role in the cover-up. But the person who orchestrated the entire operation, Nathaniel Collier, is claiming ignorance and fighting the charges. Will he be convicted? Possibly. The district attorney has strong evidence connecting Collier to a smuggling operation that brought illegal pharmaceuticals into the country and sold them to hospitals. Your husband discovered discrepancies in Margolis's books that suggested smuggling. When he tried to report it to Raymond Fletcher, Fletcher warned Collier instead of investigating. Your husband was killed to prevent him from exposing the operation, and Fletcher signed a false death certificate to cover it up. So Thomas died trying to stop criminals. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. Did he suffer? Wolfe's expression softened slightly. The poison would have acted quickly. From the onset of symptoms to loss of consciousness was perhaps an hour. From there to death, 40 minutes. He would have been confused and frightened, but the actual dying would have been relatively brief. That's something, I suppose. She looked at her hands. When I came to you, I thought Thomas had a heart attack, and the doctors were wrong. Now I know he was murdered. I'm not sure which is worse. Knowing the truth is always preferable to living with uncertainty. Is it? Thomas is still dead. Knowing why doesn't bring him back. No. But it does mean his death wasn't meaningless. Because of what he discovered and what you pursued, a smuggling operation worth millions of dollars has been shut down. Hospitals are reviewing their drug supply chains. 15 to 20 suspicious deaths are being reinvestigated, and the people responsible for those deaths will stand trial. Will Collier be convicted? I don't know. The evidence is strong, but he has resources to fight it. Trials are unpredictable, and juries are sometimes reluctant to believe wealthy, respectable men commit crimes. But the district attorney will do everything possible to secure a conviction. Mrs. Garrison nodded slowly. What happens now? You receive our final bill, which I've reduced to $15,000 given the complexity of the case and the assistance provided by Inspector Kramer's investigation. Wolfe slid a document across the desk. You resume your life. You mourn your husband. You rebuild. And you remember that he died trying to do the right thing, which is how all of us should hope to be remembered. She took the document and stood up. Thank you, Mr. Wolfe, Mr. Goodwin. I know this wasn't easy. Cases rarely are. Wolfe stood as well, which was unusual and suggested genuine respect. Mrs. Garrison, your husband was a good man who found himself confronting evil he didn't fully understand. He tried to stop it anyway. That took courage. You honoring his memory by seeking the truth took courage as well. Don't underestimate what you've accomplished. She managed a small smile. I won't. I walked her to the door. Caesar accompanied us, giving her one final inspection before she left. When she was gone, I returned to the office where Wolfe was back at his desk with a book. That's it? I said. Case closed? Case closed. We've done what we can. The rest is in the hands of prosecutors, judges and juries. He turned a page. And perhaps fate, if you believe in such things. Do you? No. I believe in evidence, logic, and the willingness of decent people to pursue justice despite obstacles. Everything else is speculation. The phone rang. I picked it up. It was Kramer. Goodwin, thought you'd want to know. We found shipping manifests in Margolis's office showing pharmaceutical imports over the past 3 years, over $5 million worth of drugs with no customs documentation or FDA approval. We're tracing the distribution now, but it looks like Metropolitan Hospital Supply was receiving regular shipments and distributing them to hospitals across Manhattan. How many hospitals? 23. Mount Sinai, Presbyterian, Beth Israel, St. Luke's, the list goes on. We're notifying them all and recommending they review their pharmaceutical inventories. Some of those drugs might still be in circulation. I repeated that to Wolfe, whose expression darkened. Tell Kramer to prioritize hospitals that treated patients who died under suspicious circumstances. If Fletcher certified 15 to 20 deaths without investigation, some of those patients may have died from contaminated drugs still being administered to others. I relayed the message. Kramer said, "Already on it. We've got teams reviewing hospital records and Fletcher's certifications. This is going to be a mess, Goodwin. Families finding out their loved ones died from illegal drugs, hospitals facing lawsuits, administrators losing their jobs. It's going to take years to sort out, but it's being sorted out. That's what matters." Yeah, thanks for the lead on this. Without your investigation, we'd never have found it. Thank Wolfe. And Mrs. Garrison. She's the one who wouldn't let it go. Kramer acknowledged and hung up. I set down the phone and looked at Wolfe. 23 hospitals, $5 million in smuggled drugs, 15 to 20 suspicious deaths. This is bigger than we thought. It usually is. Criminals don't think small. Only their initial mistakes are small. The rest escalates until someone notices and forces it into the open. Wolfe closed his book. But that's no longer our concern. We've been paid, the case is concluded, and I have orchids to attend to. Unless you have other business that requires my attention. No, sir. Then I'll be in the plant rooms until dinner. Fritz is preparing duck with orange sauce. Do try to be on time. He headed for the elevator, leaving me alone with the dogs and the satisfaction of a case that had started with a widow's suspicions and ended with a criminal network exposed. Not a perfect resolution, never was, but good enough. I spent the rest of the afternoon filing documents, balancing the checkbook, and thinking about Thomas Garrison, an accountant who'd found something wrong and tried to fix it. A husband who'd bought life insurance because he wanted his wife protected. A man who'd walked into a coroner's office, asking for help, and walked into a trap instead. He deserved better than he got. But at least now the world would know he'd died trying to do the right thing. At least now his widow had answers. At least now the people who'd killed him would face trial. It wasn't justice. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But it was something. And sometimes, in this business, something is all you get. 3 months later, on a Wednesday in June, I found myself sitting in a courtroom in Lower Manhattan watching Nathaniel Collier's trial. Wolfe had refused to attend. He hated courtrooms almost as much as he hated leaving the brownstone. But Mrs. Garrison had asked me to be there, and I'd agreed. The trial had been going for 2 weeks. The prosecution had presented Brennan's records, Fletcher's testimony, financial documents proving Collier profited from Metropolitan Hospital supply, and evidence of the smuggling operation that had killed Thomas Garrison and at least 14 other people. The defense had attacked Fletcher's credibility, questioned the authenticity of Brennan's records, and presented Nathaniel Collier as a respected businessman betrayed by subordinates. It was a standard wealthy defendant trial. Expensive suits, skilled attorneys, carefully constructed reasonable doubt. The jury looked tired. Today was closing arguments. The prosecutor, a woman named Patricia Henshaw, who'd spent 20 years putting criminals away, stood before the jury with the kind of controlled fury that comes from knowing you're right and having to prove it anyway. Ladies and gentlemen, this case is about greed. Nathaniel Collier is a wealthy man who wanted to be wealthier, so he created a company called Metropolitan Hospital Supply and used it to distribute smuggled pharmaceuticals to hospitals across Manhattan. He made millions of dollars selling illegal drugs to institutions that trusted him. And when Thomas Garrison, an accountant, discovered what Collier was doing, Collier had him murdered. She paused, letting that sink in. The defense wants you to believe Collier knew nothing about the smuggling operation, that Daniel Margolis and Dr. Brennan acted alone, that the records showing Collier's involvement were forged or misinterpreted. But the evidence tells a different story. We have financial records showing millions of dollars flowing from Metropolitan Hospital Supply to companies Collier controlled. We have correspondence between Brennan and Collier discussing drug shipments and quality control. We have testimony from Dr. Fletcher that Collier ordered him to falsify death certificates to cover up deaths caused by contaminated drugs. And we have the testimony of Mrs. Garrison, who watched her husband die from poison administered because he threatened to expose Collier's operation. She moved closer to the jury. The defense says Fletcher is lying to save himself, but Fletcher is already going to prison. He has nothing to gain from lying. He's testifying because he knows he helped cover up a murder and wants to make it right. The defense says Brennan's records are unreliable, but those records were found in Brennan's home after his death. Death, the evidence suggests, was arranged by Collier to silence him, just as Margolis's death was arranged. The defense says Collier is a respected businessman, but respected businessmen don't smuggle drugs. They don't order murders. They don't falsify death certificates to cover up crimes. She turned to look at Collier, who sat at the defense table in a perfectly tailored suit with an expression of dignified innocence. Nathaniel Collier is not a victim. He's a criminal who used his wealth and influence to run a smuggling operation that killed at least 15 people. A criminal who ordered the murder of Thomas Garrison to protect his profits. A criminal who then killed 2 more men, Margolis and Brennan, to prevent them from testifying. Ladies and gentlemen, the evidence is clear. Nathaniel Collier is guilty of conspiracy to commit murder, smuggling, racketeering, and obstruction of justice. I ask you to hold him accountable. She sat down. The defense attorney stood up, a man named Marcus Tillman, who charged $5,000 a day and earned every penny. Ladies and gentlemen, this case is not about evidence. It's about speculation. The prosecution wants you to believe my client orchestrated an elaborate criminal conspiracy based on circumstantial evidence and the testimony of a confessed criminal. But where is the proof? Where are the witnesses who can testify that Nathaniel Collier personally ordered Thomas Garrison's murder? They're dead. Where are the documents showing Collier knew about the smuggling operation? The prosecution claims Dr. Brennan's records prove it, but those records were found after Brennan's death, with no way to verify their authenticity or context. Where is the physical evidence connecting Collier to any crime? It doesn't exist. He walked toward the jury box. My client is a businessman who invested in Metropolitan Hospital Supply, believing it was a legitimate company. He attended board meetings, reviewed financial statements, and collected dividends like any other investor. He had no knowledge that Margolis and Brennan were smuggling drugs. He had no knowledge that death certificates were being falsified, and he certainly had no knowledge that Thomas Garrison was murdered. The prosecution wants you to believe otherwise, because they need someone to blame for a tragic series of crimes, but blame without proof is not justice. He turned to face the prosecutor. Dr. Fletcher testified that my client ordered him to falsify death certificates, but Fletcher is a convicted criminal trying to reduce his sentence by implicating others. His testimony is unreliable. The financial records showing money flowing to my client prove only that he received investment returns from Metropolitan Hospital Supply, which is perfectly legal. The correspondence between Brennan and my client about drug shipments proves only that they discussed legitimate business matters. None of this proves criminal intent. None of this proves murder. He moved back to the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, Nathaniel Collier has spent his life building hospitals, supporting medical research, and helping communities. He serves on the boards of 5 major hospitals. He's donated millions to charity. He's respected by colleagues, admired by peers, and trusted by institutions. The prosecution wants you to believe this man is a murderer based on circumstantial evidence and unreliable testimony. But reasonable doubt exists, and where reasonable doubt exists, you must acquit. He sat down. The judge gave final instructions to the jury, and they filed out to deliberate. Mrs. Garrison, sitting beside me in the gallery, reached for my hand. What do you think? I think Tillman's good, and I think the jury's been listening. Will they convict? I don't know. We waited. 6 hours. The jury sent out questions twice, once asking to review Fletcher's testimony, once asking to see the financial records again. At 4:30 they sent word they'd reached a verdict. The courtroom filled quickly. Mrs. Garrison gripped my hand hard enough to hurt. The jury filed back in, their faces impossible to read. The judge asked if they'd reached a verdict. The foreman stood. We have, Your Honor. On the charge of conspiracy to commit murder in the death of Thomas Garrison. How do you find? Guilty. Mrs. Garrison made a sound that was half sob, half gasp. On the charge of conspiracy to commit murder in the death of Daniel Margolis. Guilty. On the charge of conspiracy to commit murder in the death of Dr. Arthur Brennan. Guilty. The foreman continued through all the charges: smuggling, racketeering, obstruction of justice, falsifying official documents. Guilty on every count. Collier's face went white, then red. His attorney started making objections. The judge banged his gavel and called for order. When it was over, Collier was led away in handcuffs. Mrs. Garrison was crying quietly. I walked her out of the courtroom into the June sunshine, where reporters were already gathering. Thank you, she said. Thank you for not letting them get away with it. Thank Wolfe. And thank yourself. You're the one who wouldn't let it go. She nodded, wiped her eyes, and walked away. I watched her disappear into the crowd, then took a taxi back to West 35th Street. Wolfe was in the office with a book and a beer. The dogs greeted me at the door. Caesar's inspection, the others welcome, and I dropped into my chair, guilty on all counts. Wolfe looked up. Satisfactory. Mrs. Garrison was crying. I imagine she was. He set down his book. Justice was served, Archie. Not perfectly, never perfectly, but adequately. Thomas Garrison's death has been avenged. The smuggling operation has been shut down. Hospitals are safer. That's worth something. Yeah. I leaned back in my chair. How much time do you think Collier will get? 25 years minimum. Possibly life. He's 62 years old. He'll die in prison. Good. Indeed. Wolfe picked up his beer. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have correspondence to review and Fritz is preparing lamb chops for dinner. Do try to be on time. When am I ever late? Frequently. He returned to his book. I sat at my desk and thought about justice. How it's messy and slow and imperfect, but sometimes it works anyway. Thomas Garrison had died trying to expose criminals. His widow had refused to accept the official story. Wolfe had investigated. Kramer had prosecuted. And today, 3 months after a widow walked into our office with suspicions nobody believed, the man who'd ordered her husband's death was convicted. Not perfect, but good enough. Outside, June in Manhattan continued its warm, busy existence. Inside the brownstone, the dogs settled into their positions. Fritz worked in the kitchen, and Wolfe read about Byzantine taxation or orchid cultivation or whatever else caught his interest. Another case closed, another bill paid, another killer behind bars. And somewhere, maybe, Thomas Garrison could rest, knowing his death hadn't been in vain. That's all any of us can hope for, really. To matter, to make a difference, to leave the world slightly better than we found it. Thomas Garrison did that. So did his widow. So, in our own way, did we. And on a Wednesday in June, that felt like enough.